January to December. Another expired calendar, another trip around the sun, another candle on all of our cakes. But that doesn't mean it wasn't fun. Welcome to the In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and 2024 was a crazy year. And we here at the In-Between would like to tip our caps to Father Time and to the YouTube algorithm for the awesome blessings bestowed upon the channel this past year. And to celebrate, we've decided to honor those videos that have risen to the top thanks to all of you. So this episode is a special one of the top 5 videos for 2024 as a thank you for helping to make it all happen. And for you, our new viewers, think of this video as a great way of discovering what the In-Between is all about. Our number 5 video may not have been way over the top in views, but it has sailed its way into the hearts and minds of those who watched it. Willis George Emerson was what those in the late 19th century would call a jack of all trades. He was a real estate developer, a lawyer, a newspaperman, a promoter, a politician, and eventually an author. Earlier years that had previously been spent in Chicago, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, just to name a few, turned into latter years that would see Willis move to California to relax in his retirement and take up writing. And on one fateful afternoon walk, Willis would meet one Olaf Janssen, a man that Willis would come to know as a simple, yet extraordinarily well-educated Norwegian fisherman. A man Willis would come to regard as a friend, visiting the elderly Olaf in his simple bungalow home quite often. Willis was quite entertained by Olaf's fantastical tales of his adventures on the sea, but he knew that Olaf was not telling him the whole story, only handing out bite-sized chunks that inevitably left Willis eager for more. And while Willis didn't necessarily believe Olaf's stories, he certainly was entertained and enthralled by Olaf's conviction that not only are the stories true, but that one day he would tell Willis the whole story. Then one night about 2 a.m., Willis is woken up by a knocking at his front door. It's a messenger with a note from Olaf simply saying,
"Am ill unto death. Come."
So Willis rushes over to Olaf's house, finding him lying on the couch, indeed at death's door. Olaf tells him, "I know I'm not going to see the sun come up, so you have to listen to me. I have to tell you the whole story." And with that, Willis listens to Olaf, who with newfound strength, given the importance of getting his story out in full, proceeds to tell Willis the following story. Olaf is the son of Norwegian parents, who is actually born in Russia while his parents are on a fishing trip. He starts helping his dad on fishing trips starting when he's only 7 years old. He's a pretty smart kid, so he's busy in a private school from 9 to 14 years old, but then goes back to helping his dad fish after that. His dad, Jens, is exactly what you would probably picture in your head when you think of a Norwegian fisherman. A big, stout guy, 6'3" and over 200 pounds, as rugged and strong-willed as they come. So for a number of years, this was life, father and son fishing together. April 3rd, 1829, when Olaf is 19, they set out on yet another expedition. Jens is pretty excited about this one. The year before, he had found some big ivory tusks on the western shores of Franz Josef Land that had sold for some pretty good money at the Stockholm markets. So he was hoping that they could swing by that way again on this trip. So the two set out on their little fishing sloop, heading south from Stockholm, rounding around Denmark and north up the coast of Norway. The winds are pretty favorable, and before you know it, after a few stops here and there, they are again on the shores of Franz Josef Land. Now, Jens being the typical Norseman, held Thor and Odin as his gods and never missed an opportunity to tell Olaf that they came from far beyond the north wind, where there is land more beautiful than any that mortal man has ever known. And as the two look north to the open sea with a warm Gulf breeze at their backs, Jens relays the story once again. Olaf, inspired by his father's dedication and passion for the legends, and no doubt helped along by the invincibility of youth, says, "Let's go find it." And just like that, their fishing expedition turns into an exploration adventure. They sail north for 3 days when they come across this little island and decide to stop and explore for a while. They notice that there's not a single tree on the island, but the north shoreline is covered with driftwood. Some pieces so big that they're more like drift trees. They're like 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. I wonder where those came from. They get back in the boat and keep going north. And they notice that the air is way warmer than they thought it would be, considering how far north they are. It's warmer than it was before they left the coast of Norway. But not every moment is sunshine and roses. They get caught in a blizzard with gale force winds and huge waves. The little boat is tossed around so violently that both of them have to tie themselves to the boat and pray that the boat doesn't get crushed by floating chunks of ice. But Jens is not worried. He tells Olaf over the crashing waves and wind, "Be courageous, my son. Odin is the god of the waters and companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not." By the time the storm is over, they have lost 2/3 of their food and all of their fresh water. They have 2 barrels left, but they're empty. That is a problem. But Jens just tells Olaf, "Don't worry, Odin's got this." Olaf, not so sure about that, goes down below and brings up a bowl so he can scoop up some water and wash his face. When he splashes his face with the water, it's fresh water. Olaf then starts drinking the water when Jens says, "Are you nuts? We're in the middle of the ocean." But then he tastes it too and confirms it. They are surrounded with fresh water. Not wasting a second, they immediately fill their 2 empty water barrels with water. Olaf has no idea how they can be floating in fresh water, but Jens just tells him, "I told you Odin's got our back." About the same time, they notice their compass acting funny, moving all over the place. But it was steady enough for them to know that they're still heading in a relatively northern direction. They keep moving like this for a couple of weeks with not much going on, just continually moving north. When Jens calls out, "Hey, Olaf!" He points to a spot in the sky ahead of them where Olaf can see this dull red version of the sun. It's not the real sun, that's firmly overhead. Remember, this is the north in the summer, so the sun doesn't set for months at a time. And even though it's around August already by their best guess, the sun is above their heads where it has been the entire trip. Jens tells him, "I've heard about this. It's called a mock sun. It's like a reflection or a mirage. It'll be gone again pretty soon." But it wasn't. As the days go on, they can see that mock sun in the sky at least 12 hours of every 24-hour period. And the more they look at it, they decide it certainly isn't a mirage. It isn't any kind of reflection of the sun. It's a real thing. Must be some kind of planet or something. After a few more days of exhilarating blank ocean views, Olaf has taken a nap. Imagine that. When his father wakes him up. Land. Olaf jumps up to see for himself, and sure enough, there it is. The sandy beach that goes on as far as the eye can see, backed up by trees and vegetation. Olaf and Jens just stand there, gobsmacked. Olaf looks at his father and is moved by the look on his father's face, a mixture of awe and gratitude. And Olaf knows his father is giving thanks to Odin and Thor. They follow the coast for another 3 days, compass still pointing north, before they hit the mouth of a huge river. They turned their boat in that direction and sailed for another 10 full days, past sandy beaches and endless forests of huge trees. And then they figure out that the water has turned fresh. None too soon, as they're almost out. So they finally drop anchor, fill their water barrels, and wade onto the beach, finding some nut trees, the fruit of which tastes amazing after, near as they can figure, 5 months of the same boring food day after day. They hadn't been there very long when they hear what sounds like a huge choir getting louder and louder. And then into view comes the largest ship they have ever seen, sailing right for them. As the ship gets close to their boat, it stops and lowers a small boat loaded with 6 men, all of whom are the tallest men Olaf has ever seen. The 6 men, who speak a language neither Jens nor Olaf understand, laughing and talking amongst themselves, look over their boat with curiosity, especially interested in their compass, and then through various hand gestures seem to invite the two onto their ship. Jens looks at Olaf and says, "Well, what do you think? They seem nice enough. The worst they can do is kill us." And with that, the two accept the giant's invitation. In less than a half an hour, both men and their ship are all aboard this mammoth ship, which they would later learn is called the Naz, or in their language, the Pleasure Cruise. Jens and Olaf are amazed at the hundreds of people aboard this cruise ship. The men are all about 12 feet tall, with the captain standing at about 13 feet tall. Jens, at 6'3", barely hits the waistlines of these people. And the women are all about 10 to 11 feet tall. And all of them seem to have this wonderful, healthful glow. They are welcomed at the giant's table for their feast, although the giants are amused that they have to come up with something different for chairs for their guests because they're so small in comparison. And never once do Jens and Olaf fear for their safety. Jens sits back at the table looking particularly satisfied and says, "This is the land beyond the north wind. Our fathers would be proud." The boat is quickly turned around in the river and starts heading back in the direction they had come from. Interestingly enough, even though they're moving faster than any form of transportation Olaf has ever seen, neither man can hear any motors running. It's a totally quiet ride. The captain appoints a man named Jules Galdea and his wife to be in charge of Jens and Olaf, to teach them everything they can. And the Janssens are eager to learn. The ship is illuminated by a light source that the Janssens don't quite understand, but what Olaf would later in life come to assume was electricity. But at that time, in 1829, electricity was not yet a thing for the outer world. They sail for another 2 full days before reaching their destination, noticing along the way that what they thought at first was a mirage, then another planet, that ruddy red globe is now hanging in the sky and illuminating the strange land in full view as their view of the sun continually diminishes until it can't be seen at all. When they finally reach the port town of Jehu, they are greeted with huge, beautiful houses that all look the same yet different, and farmland and vineyards as far as the eyes can see, and gold. Doesn't take them long to figure out that gold is not too rare there, because it's everywhere, inlaid on doors, covering the domes of city buildings, as a veneer on tables, and especially on the extra ornate temples to music. The vegetation is crazy, super lush everywhere. One bunch of grapes is 4 to 5 feet long, with each grape as big as an orange, and apples the size of a man's head. And everything else is just as huge. The forest trees are so big that the redwoods of California would be mere underbrush in comparison. They learn that one of the main, if not the main city, is called Eden. It's the place from where the government of the people operates. But they stay in Yehu for a full year, learning the language, which they conclude is something pretty close to Sanskrit, and the customs of the land from their very patient teachers, the Galdeas, Jules and his wife. One day, they're visited by an envoy from the ruler in Eden and are grilled for 2 days. How did they get there? What gods do they worship? What is life like on the outside? You name it. And again, their compass seems to be of particular interest, which is still pointing north. Although by now, between the behavior of the compass and the way the sun disappeared and was replaced by the glowing red orb in the sky, they have pretty much come to the conclusion that they are indeed inside the Earth. By Jens's calculations, based on how long they were sailing, he estimates that the thickness of the Earth between the outer layer and the inner layer is about 300 miles. So in essence, inner Earth is only 600 miles smaller in diameter than outer Earth. That's a pretty big inner Earth. Just to put things in perspective, the outer diameter of Earth is roughly 7,925 miles, or 12,750 kilometers from one side to the other through the center, depending on where you are measuring. If the crust is 300 miles thick, that makes the diameter of inner Earth roughly, let's call it 7,300 miles or 11,750 kilometers from one side to the other. That's a pretty big place. And after spending over a year watching and learning more from the people about the red orb in the sky, Olaf and Jens can see that it glows more red in the morning and in the evening. During most of the day, it seems to be shrouded by this white, almost luminescent cloud. And at the base of the orb is black, with lots of little holes in whatever this black is. However, by whatever act of gravity or vacuum that exists on the inside, the orb stays stationary. It's the spinning of the Earth that moves them around the orb. The nut effect? For the people of the inner Earth, it looks like the sun rises every morning in the east and sets every night in the west, just like ours. And when they are at the point during the night where they are passing under the dark base with the holes in it, they can look up and see points of light just like our stars, only a little bit bigger. And the Jansens also learned that the people consider the dark part of the orb as the seat of their god, their Jehovah, the smoky god as they call it, constantly looking down on and out for the people on the land. Once the 2 outsiders have been properly vetted, they are taken to Eden by way of some kind of monorail train that's super fast and totally silent. And just a little note, Olaf didn't use the word train. He called it a conveyance because at the time, it was a totally foreign concept for him. Even though moving heavy things on rails had been a regular practice by 1829, the real trains as we know them today were just getting started in the US. And these inner Earth trains were not the trains that we know today either. Like I said before, it was a monorail system where the car is kept level and balanced by some kind of flywheel on the roof of every car that, to the best of the Jansens' understanding, worked to kind of almost counteract the effect of atmospheric pressure, creating almost like a vacuum around the car, keeping it upright. They finally get to Eden, and this place is beautiful. It's kind of like a plateau high above the land around it. It's actually the highest point of the inner lands, and this plateau is covered in trees and fruit and flowers, all in full bloom. It's gorgeous. And the plateau is also the spot where a huge freshwater spring flows, feeding 4 rivers: the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. And the Hiddekel is the one that the Jansens sailed in on. And that flow out into the land and divide it into 4 sections. Eventually, they are led into a great hall covered in, you guessed it, lots of gold. And sitting there waiting for them is their little ship, just as it was when it was taken out of the water and transported by the big ship that found them. They are greeted by the great high priest, who stands roughly 14 to 15 feet tall, who talks with them for like 2 hours, asking a ton of questions that his envoys had evidently forgotten to ask, fascinated by the answers from these 2 foreign visitors to his land. At the end, the great high priest asks them what they would like to do now. Do you want to stay here with us or go back home? Jens tells them they would like to stay for a while and explore the rest of this inner land, but then they would eventually like to go home. Mom's waiting for us. The great ruler says, no problem with exploring here. Jules Galdea will escort you anywhere you want to go. But when you're done, I gotta tell you, you might not make it back. It's a pretty dangerous trip. But when the time comes, if you still want to give it a try, we will put your boat back at the mouth of the Hiddekel where you started and wish you Jehovah's speed. So the Janssen boys spend the next year touring around the different countries of this inner world. They learn more about the people, that they usually live to 600 or even 800 years old. They don't even start school until they're 20. They go to school for 30 years, of which a minimum of 10 is spent learning music, with choirs of beautiful singing voices that can be as big as 25,000 people. Their exploration outside of the cities is just as astonishing, walking through forests of trees 1,000 feet tall, birds with 30-foot wingspans, and eggs 2 feet tall. Interesting note about the birds. Not only do they see plenty of species that seem to fit the larger-than-life motif of this whole place, but they see plenty of smaller birds, ones which are pretty much the same size you would see in the trees and forests of either the US or Europe. And about the same time, scientists have noticed that a number of bird species have gone missing. And I say missing because they have disappeared faster than they would if they were going through a normal extinction process. So the question is it possible that some of these bird populations have decided to make the land within their new home? But back to the crazy wildlife. Jules brings Jens and Olaf to a particular beach that's full of thousands of tortoises that are 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 7 or 8 feet tall. They see elephants that are 75 feet tall and 100 feet long. There's just something about this place that has the perfect conditions for abundant life. All life, the plants, the animals, and the people. Olaf's not sure, but he thinks it has something to do with the air. There's an energy, almost an electricity to it that is almost palpable. Never for the rest of his long life would he ever feel as good as he did the 2 years he and his father spent in the inner world. After a full year of exploring this inner land, the Janssen boys decide it's time to go back home. So they make their way back to Jehu and spend a full month fixing up their fishing boat, making sure it can withstand what is most likely going to be a challenging run through fields of icebergs. The Galdeas and everyone else are sad to see them go, but they offer them a parting gift of as many bags of gold nuggets as they dare to store on the boat. The men and their boat are loaded back onto the Naz, the same ship that brought them in, and taken back to the mouth of the Hiddekel River, where they are placed back in the water and launched. The giants, seeing them off, are not only sad to see them go, but are more than a little concerned for their safety. And Jens promises them that he will return in a year or two to pay them a visit. With that, they say their goodbyes and hoist their sails as the Naz turns around and heads back to Jehu. Except they didn't move. They try for 3 days, but are bucking winds the whole time. Jens finally figures out that since they've been there almost 2.5 years, their homeland is now in the throes of winter, which means total dark and unfavorable winds. Not a good deal for trying to navigate around icebergs. So Jens has a suggestion. Let's go the other way and sail back down through the inner world, come out the southern end, which is summer right now, and sail home from there. So that's what they do. They have a good wind and a swift current and get to the southern opening in only 40 days, where they drop anchor, resupply, and rest up for what is most likely going to be a harrowing ride back to the outer surface. Oh, and they also find some 9-foot tall penguins. Once they finally set their sails for the outer surface, the first few days are pretty easy. The warm wind from the inside pushes them onward with mild temperatures, and the handoff between the internal red sun to the external yellow sun happens exactly as predicted. But once they get a ways away from the influence of those internal winds, the air starts getting colder, and the icebergs are not far behind. They continue cautiously until they find themselves stuck between two behemoth office building-sized chunks of ice that are dueling it out, crashing into one another, sending chunks of ice flying. Olaf and Jens are safe for the moment. They saw the danger with enough time to drop their sails, but as they just bob in the water, all they can do is watch and pray that none of those flying ice chunks come their way. After a few hours, looks like the battle is over as the icebergs start to slowly drift apart, creating a small channel where they can scoot through. It's a risk, though. What if the bergs start coming back together? But they've gotten this far, right? They hoist the sails and shoot on through the narrow passage without a scratch. They spend the next 45 days with a good wind in their sails, kind of hunting and pecking their way through the fields of icebergs, always watching for the open channels to sail through. When Jens says, "You know what, Olaf? I think we're going to make it." They can see that there are just a few more icebergs in their way, an open ocean beyond that. They steal a quick moment to pat themselves on their backs for a job well done. They still have water, they still have food, they still have gold. And the trip northward to home will be a piece of cake when they hear the explosion. At least that's what it sounded like. But in reality, the mammoth iceberg that they're lazily sailing past has just split into pieces. And if you've ever seen an iceberg calving, you know that it's best to be far, far away. Because if the moving ice doesn't get you, the massive displacement of water just might. But Olaf and Jens are not far away. They're right next to it. As the outside piece moves and starts to roll on its side, the part that had been under the water rises up under their boat and sends it flying onto the new top of the berg. That actually sounds pretty lucky to me, except that the berg is not finished. Drop an ice cube in a glass of water and you'll notice that the ice submerges for a moment before finding its floating equilibrium. Icebergs do the same thing, but at a slightly slower pace. Olaf is thrown out of the boat and onto the ice, but Jens is stuck in the rigging of the boat. Olaf knows the iceberg is going to go down before it's done and can do nothing but watch his father struggling to free himself and hopes that when the inevitable rush of water comes, sucking anything on top down with it, that the boat will be able to right itself and save everything inside, including his father. The iceberg does exactly what Olaf thought it would and starts to sink under the surface as icy water comes rushing at him from all sides. And a moment later, everything goes dark. Olaf wakes up a while later, almost completely frozen inside and out, laying on the level open expanse of the new top of the floating chunk of ice, about 50 feet above the surface of the water. But no sign of the boat. Olaf gets up and starts circling the edge of the floating plateau, carefully looking over the edge down to the water, praying that a miracle has somehow happened and that his father would be safely floating below. Nope. But Olaf keeps looking. He slowly walks around, looking over the edge, looking for the boat for hours and hours. He can't stop. If he stops, then he has to admit the truth to himself that his father is dead and he is now stranded on the top of an iceberg with no food or way of generating any heat. When he literally can't move anymore, he stops. And the silence, solitude, and despair all rush in, just like the water had, threatening to drown him once again, when the deafening quiet is broken by the crack of a signal gun firing. It's a whaling ship, not even half a mile away. Apparently, Olaf's incessant circling around the top of the iceberg had caught their attention. And just like that, by the divine intervention of Odin and Thor, Olaf is saved. However, the welcoming party isn't welcoming for very long. As soon as Olaf is aboard, naturally, the captain of the Scottish whaling ship called the Arlington, Angus McPherson, asks him how in the hell he ended up floating alone on the top of an iceberg. Olaf, being only about 21 or 22 now and still pretty naive, assumes they will all be interested in his extraordinary tales, so he spills the beans on his whole adventure, beginning to end. Before the last words are even out of his mouth, the captain orders him locked up in irons as a complete loon. But over the course of a few days, Olaf is able to convince the captain that those were just the statements of a madman. He's better now, and he can help with the ship. So Captain McPherson lets Olaf loose, and Olaf becomes a member of the whaling crew until they finally arrive back home in Scotland. By the time Olaf makes it back to Stockholm, he's been gone for 4 years and 8 months. He finds out his mother had just passed away the year before, but that everything he was due to inherit had been placed in trust to his extended family, who rightfully turns it over to him. But Olaf can't forget the amazing things he has seen and the insane adventure he was on. He wants to go back. So he finally gathers the courage to talk to his uncle, Gustav Osterland, who's pretty well-to-do. He tells Uncle Gustav the whole story, hoping he can convince him to finance another expedition back to the lands beyond the North Wind. Gustav tells Olaf, "Wow, that's quite a story, but you have my attention. Tell you what, I'll get a meeting together with some of the town's higher ups. You can tell them what you told me, and maybe we can get their support too." Olaf is like, "Right on." And he goes in front of the town officials and tells his story. At the end of which, Gustav says, "I told you he was nuts." Papers are signed, and Olaf is taken away to an insane asylum where he languishes for 28 years, professing his sanity the entire time. On the 17th of October, 1862, Olaf is finally released. But to what? His family's all dead and his friends are strangers. He's now over 50 years old, and anybody who knows anything about him only knows him as a lunatic. He has nothing. So, leaning on the only thing he's ever known how to do, he gets a job on a fishing boat. And he actually does pretty well for himself. So much so that after only 5 years, he saves enough money to buy his own fishing boat and spends the next 22 years fishing his own boat. And in his spare time, reading anything he can get his hands on. Since he has no wife and kids, and nothing else to really spend any of his money on, by 1889, he figures out he has enough money to live on for the rest of his life. So he sells his boat and moves to America. After spending a few years in Chicago, Olaf moves to sunny California and buys himself a nice bungalow house in a nice, quiet neighborhood. Which brings us back to where we started this whole story, the meeting of Olaf and Willis Emerson. Olaf, on his deathbed, tells Willis the whole story from beginning to end, weaving together all of the incomplete tidbits that he had already shared, and then supplies Willis with maps and information that back up what he's saying. Once Olaf finishes unloading all of that information that he has kept locked away onto Willis, the burden that he feels to get the truth out, which he couldn't do before because he was afraid of being locked up again. Once that burden is lifted, Olaf slips into eternal rest with his forefathers on the morning of January 3rd, 1908. But that's not quite the end. Olaf makes Willis promise to share his story with the world, which Willis does by documenting Olaf's entire story in a book called The Smoky God, which he publishes in that same year, 1908. The book is now in public domain, so you can just go search it up right on Google, download it, and read it for yourself. It's actually a pretty quick read. So is it real? Well, on the one hand, while Willis states in the book's foreword that this is a true story, wouldn't be the first time that a fiction author has used that tool to help their readers suspend their disbelief for a while. And all of Willis's other books were fiction. On the other hand, this book is full of footnotes where Willis passes along the corroborating evidence that backs up his account. Is it smoking gun evidence? Of course not, but it certainly makes Olaf's claims more compelling for sure. And there are some rather intriguing passages that talk about not only the monorail system that he traveled on, but also something akin to a modern-day cell phone, neither of which would have been anywhere close to real life in 1830s Scandinavia or the US. Now, the monorail could probably be explained by saying that the railroad system was well established by the beginning of the 20th century when Willis wrote the book, so maybe he just took that idea and ran with it. Same goes for the cell phone, which Olaf describes as, by some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country on air currents. Could Willis have just been a great science fiction writer, taking what is new to them and taking it to the next level? Sure. Tesla even filed a patent application in 1903 for a wireless phone. But I find it hard to believe that those two instances are the only glimpses into his science fiction genius, because he certainly didn't ever rise to fame as a science fiction author. Do we have anything going for us in favor of this being true? We do. Thanks to a YouTube channel called Webflix, we know that while there is no record of Olaf entering the US through Ellis Island, there is a record of him living in Chicago and a record of him being in California at the same times that Willis describes. Not only that, but there is proof that the captain of the Scottish whaling ship, Angus MacPherson, also existed, with an entry in the 1841 Scottish census showing him to be 45 at the time, born in 1796 in Inverness, Scotland, with his occupation listed as a merchant seaman. Also, and I get that this is circumstantial, but the book is littered with footnotes for supporting information that were provided by Olaf. Can't say that I've ever read a science fiction novel with real-world footnotes. So I asked the question again. Is it real? Who knows? Let us know what you think in the comments. But I can tell you this. The way the scientific community is run today, and with the government restrictions on polar travel, no real expeditions with real scientists will be going out to find an answer anytime soon if they want to keep their careers. My personal hope is that with the increase of knowledge and technology that we see every day, we, the people, will be able to find out for ourselves. Our number 4 episode for 2024 opened up a whole new mountain of possibilities for encountering high strangeness within a landscape of breathtaking beauty. Mount Shasta, located in Northern California, about an hour south of Oregon, is 14,179 feet above sea level within the 2.2 million acre Shasta Trinity National Forest. It is the second highest peak and the southernmost volcano in the Cascade Range. And it appears as though no one has a clue as to when it last erupted. The United States Geological Survey says 3,200 years ago. The Global Volcanism Program says 870 years ago, while sailors of the French La Pérouse expedition say they saw it go off just 200 years ago. But regardless of its past, in 2018, the USGS updated its list of the most hazardous volcanoes in the country, and Mount Shasta ranked 5th out of the list's 18 very high threat volcanoes. I don't really like those odds. Now, in order to put the whole of Mount Shasta craziness into context, I first need to start with the tale of 2 fabled cities about 1 million years ago. Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean and Lemuria, or Mu, in the Pacific. And according to legend, between these two, they pretty much owned the rest of the world. They are both very technologically advanced. More advanced than we are. And even though Atlantis had the advantage over Lemuria, Atlanteans were a benevolent society that lived in peace with the Lemurians for millennia. However, about 25,000 years ago, the Atlanteans got a little too big for their britches and decided world domination sounded like a good idea. The Lemurians said, "I don't think so," and the two begin a war to end all wars. By the time they're done, their advanced weaponry has done so much damage to the surface of the Earth that the tectonic plates shift, causing the magnetic poles to shift so suddenly that a massive global flood wipes out both civilizations. Millions of people die on both sides. A few surviving Atlanteans evacuate to Agartha, an underground city inside the Hollow Earth. Upcoming episode, anyone? The last of the Lemurians fled to Mount Shasta and established a city called Telos, which legend claims now houses 1.5 million highly evolved spiritual beings. Now, the Native American tribes in the area will tell you that Shasta was created by the Old Man of the Sky, who, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, wanted to come down to Earth from the heavens, but he didn't have a way to climb down. So he made a hole in the sky and shoved dirt and ice through the hole into a pile until it was tall enough for him to climb down onto the Earth. Then he creates life on Earth, but goes a little nuts about it and makes too many grizzly bears, which scare the crap out of him. So he hollows out the mountain to create a teepee to stay in. They say you could still see the smoke rising from the top until the white man came. Native American tribes are documented as living around that area going back 7,000 to 10,000 years, but it's likely the Lemurians are homeless and looking for new digs before that. So maybe, and I'm just throwing this out here, maybe the Lemurians built the mountain themselves as a new gated community condo complex for themselves. I mean, if they had the technology to destroy the known world, maybe they have the technology to build a mountain. And one of the reasons I say this is because of the location of the mountain. Most mountains are part of a range. I mean, Shasta's part of a range, the Cascade Range, but it's still just sitting there in the middle of relatively flat country, like somebody just plopped it there. I mean, if the Lemurians didn't make it, then the Old Man of the Sky sure did. Fast forward to the summer of 1883. Frederick S. Oliver, a teenager at the time, is helping his family stake out their mining claim. And as he's writing down notes and coordinates of the claim's location, his hand starts shaking and writing notes in his notebook against Frederick's will. He understandably starts to panic and runs home, with his hand trying to write the whole time. Frederick's mother doesn't panic. She just gives him a piece of paper to write on. By the time this episode is over shortly thereafter, Frederick and his mother are shocked to realize that what he has written down is the beginning of some weird dissertation. Over the next few years, Frederick would occasionally have his hand commandeered by this outside force named Philos the Tibetan, who would dictate a few more pages here and there. Philos is a spirit entity who has lived a previous life as an Atlantean, who obviously finds it pretty important to get a hold of somebody who can write down information about the Atlantean civilization. Although, I would think that if they had been that technologically advanced, they would have thought to invent paper. Or maybe Philos is just really bored. Anyway, this goes on until 1895, when Philos has apparently said all he needs to say. Frederick Oliver dies 4 years later at the age of 33. We will come back to Frederick in a moment. Skip ahead a couple of years to 1904, when a British prospector, J.C. Brown, comes to Mount Shasta on behalf of the Lord Cowdray Mining Company to look for gold. One day, while exploring the mountain, Brown stumbles across a rockfall, and it just looks kind of odd, like maybe there's something behind it. So he starts to clear it. And it doesn't take long before he realizes that behind that pile of rocks is a tunnel leading down into the darkness. And seeing as though he's there to look for gold, a tunnel into the mountain is awesome. So he starts down the tunnel. Now, the fact that there's a tunnel there is not that unusual. There are lava tubes all over the mountain that go on for miles, the longest being Pluto's Cave, which is hikeable for over a mile before you get to the unsafe parts. Who knows how long it really is? So JC starts hiking for miles and miles into the darkness. By his estimate, he hikes 11 miles before reaching the end. And what's at the end seems way more valuable than gold. He finds a network of rooms and chambers almost like an abandoned ancient city. He finds ornate statues that seem to glow in the dark, crystals, tablets, weapons and shields made of gold, and items that to him seem like machines of some kind. But the most shocking find is what looks to be a burial chamber that holds at least 27 mummies ranging from 6 to 10 feet tall in ornately decorated robes. Now, obviously, he's very excited about this find. It is an archaeological Disneyland. But not being an archaeologist, he's not quite sure what to do. So he covers the tunnel entrance and pretends he didn't find anything until he can figure out his next move. 1 year later, so 1905, Frederick Oliver's mom publishes the book of writings her son had channeled over those few years, called A Dweller on Two Planets, which turns out to be a whole accounting of the Atlantean civilization and technology. He even describes some pretty modern concepts like quantum mechanics, anti-gravity, zero-point energy, and mass transit. And the mass transit vehicle of choice? The cigar-shaped airship. Now, apparently, the Lemurians are just a little smarter than the Atlanteans because they don't need to channel anyone to get their history recorded. They manage to write down their history and leave it in the capable hands of the Hindus in India, who then share the information with a guy named James Churchward, who then publishes a book in 1926 detailing the history of Lemuria, which he renames Mu. So back to our guy, J.C. Brown. While he's toiling away at regular life, he's still trying to figure out exactly what it is he found in that cave. He becomes obsessed with Churchward's book about the lost continent of Mu, and most certainly would have heard of the Lemurians as well as Frederick Oliver's book on Atlantis. And after all of his research, he decides that the cave must belong to the Lemurian civilization that is residing in the mountain. That's it. Time to go back. So after 30 years, JC heads back to the Mount Shasta area, and he is so steeped in all of the legend and the lore of the Lemurians that he actually starts giving daily lectures on the topic. Through these lectures, he manages to put together a search team of 80 people, including researchers, scientists, and explorers, to go back to the mountain with him to find the tunnel. The expedition is scheduled for June 19th, 1934. And it's a really big deal. The newspapers write about it, and everybody in town is excited. The whole team of 80 adventurers assembles, ready to find this lost city. But JC is nowhere to be found. In fact, no one sees hide nor hair of him ever again. So what happened to him? Was he taken out by people who didn't want this information getting out? Maybe it was the government. The government keeps secrets? Or did he earn himself a one-way ticket into the city of Telos by the Lemurians themselves? Or maybe he was just a con man. Maybe. But he never took a single dime of anyone's money. Not a very good con man. His strange disappearance obviously leads people to question the authenticity of Brown's entire story of the subterranean city of riches with giant mummies that he supposedly found. But that didn't stop people from looking. Numerous modern explorers have claimed to have found Brown's tunnel, mummies and all. Although its location and even its existence remains a mystery. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that somebody has claimed to have figured out the mystery of J.C. Brown. In 2017, a researcher named Stephen Sindoni, who coincidentally is a believer in the legends of Lemuria, well, he tracked down a man named John Benjamin Bodie, a mining engineer who retired in Mount Shasta. Bodie worked for the Lord Cowdery Mining Company. So did J.C. Brown. And Bodie's in-laws lived right across the street from where J.C. Brown had given his daily lectures on Lemuria and the lost city of Telos. Obviously, the inference is that J.C. Brown was really John Benjamin Bodie. Interesting, but why? Why go through all the trouble of setting up this gigantic ruse? Or maybe it's just a coincidence. If they were working for the same company, maybe they were both assigned to the same area. For whatever reason, J.C. Brown is gone, missing. But he's certainly not the only one. Mount Shasta is one of the most notorious spots in the country for mysterious disappearances. And here are a couple of the craziest. On September 2nd, 2011, a family of 4 are camping on Mount Shasta at Camp 4 of Fowler's Campground in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Around 6 p.m., the 3.5-year-old toddler and his sister are playing with some other kids by the river. The other kids come back, but the boy doesn't. The family immediately launches a search, but after about 15 minutes of not finding him, they don't mess around and call 911. Within 45 minutes of the arrival of the police, 100 people are already searching. So from about 7:30 p.m. to midnight, they are just combing everywhere. Then, just before midnight, the dogs find the boy hiding in a bush on the side of a trail that has already been searched many times. They take him back to camp, and they all have a nice, happy reunion. High fives all around, search successful. Fast forward over a year. A user by the name of Miss Cat 1 posts that she is the grandmother of the 3-year-old boy. She goes on to explain that about 3 weeks after that harrowing camping trip, the boy's at her house and out of the blue says, "I don't like the other Cappy," which was his name for her, Grandma Kathy. So she says, "What are you talking about, buddy? I'm the only Grandma Cappy." He says, "Don't you remember when I was lost in the woods? Well, the other Grandma Cappy grabbed me and took me to a creepy place. She's really a robot." Now, thinking that her grandson just has a wild imagination, she asks him, what was creepy about it? "It was a cave with spiders, and there were purses and guns." I was too scared, so I didn't touch anything. But when she climbed a ladder, the light made her look like a robot. There were other robots too, but they didn't move. Kathy asks him why he thought she looked like a robot. And he tells his grandma that she had your same hair, your feet, and even your face. And the light sparkled on her, and she looked like a robot. So Kathy's thinking, maybe he means a hologram. So she asks him what a robot is, and he says it's made out of metal and has a remote control. Okay, so he knows what a robot looks like. Her curiosity is at a 10. She asks him for more information, and he tells her, she made me lay down to look at my tummy. Then she tried to get me to poop on a sticky paper, but I couldn't go. She told me that I am from outer space, and they put me in my mommy's tummy. Then she took me back to the river and said to wait under the bush until someone found me. Grandma Kathy calls his dad, wondering what in the hell he's been letting this kid watch on TV. And the dad says, yeah, he told me that story too. Crazy kids, huh? Now, normally, she would have chalked this up to the incredible imagination of a 3-year-old. That is, if she hadn't already had her own experience. Just 1 year earlier, she was camping in the same area with a friend. She's in a tent, and the friend is in a camper. Other than the fact that it's completely silent, they have a nice night by the fire. In fact, neither of them has seen any wildlife so far. No birds, no squirrels, no bugs, except for the 2 crows perched in the trees, praying for food scraps to hit the ground. Before they call it a night, they hear something in the trees. So they shine their flashlights in that direction and are met with several pairs of red eyeshine. They just assume it's a herd of deer heading for the river, and they just go to their separate beds. In the morning, Kathy is a little surprised when she wakes up face first in the dirt outside of her tent and sleeping bag. Now, as she puts it, I'm a grandma in my 50s. I don't sleep in the dirt. She notices a pain on the back of her neck and reaches around to discover 2 puncture wounds. Plus, she's violently ill. She puts the puncture wounds together with the nausea and thinks, must be a spider bite. Reasonable conclusion. Except her friend in the camper also wakes up with puncture wounds on the back of his neck and is super sick. Interesting coincidence. Now, all of that might sound just a little too far off the beaten path for some of you, but we have another missing person story that is about as straight as they come. And that is the story of Carl Landers. Carl was a 69-year-old man who was on a mission to summit the highest peak in every county in California. He'd already tackled 57 of the 58, which left Mount Shasta in Siskiyou County in Northern California. And Carl may have been 69, but to summit those other 57 peaks means he's already tackled Mount Whitney at 14,505 feet, White Mountain Peak at 14,252 feet, and Northern Palisade at 14,248 feet, all higher than Shasta. So he's not a novice hiker. Despite his wife having a bad feeling in her gut about this whole trip, on May 24th, 1999, Carl sets out to conquer the last of the giants, Mount Shasta, with a couple of his friends, Barry Gilmore, age 60, and Milton Gaines, age 64, also experienced hikers. So when Carl, Barry, and Milton start off that morning from Bunny Flat Trailhead, heading up the Avalanche Gulch route to the top, everybody thought they're all good to go. The Avalanche Gulch route is a very straightforward trail up to the top and is the route of choice for most people. Now, I'm not going to say that it's easy. It's a total distance up and back of 11 miles. You're starting at almost 7,000 feet and ascending another 7,300 feet. But as mountain summits go, this one is relatively easy and safe. Should be a routine trip. By the evening of May 24th, the three men had made it all the way past Horse Camp to 50-50 Flats. They stopped there because they wanted to spend the night adjusting to the altitude before heading up to Helen Lake, another campsite just 650 feet away from 50-50 Flats, but a gain in altitude of 1,200 feet. Now, Carl, while definitely in good shape and definitely experienced, was suffering from a little bit of altitude sickness. Altitude sickness is when you get into areas of higher elevation where the oxygen is thinner, making it harder to get enough oxygen and can cause a myriad of flu-like symptoms. The next morning, May 25th, everyone wakes up and Carl says, I'm still not feeling all that great, which means I'm probably going to move slow today. So I'm going to go ahead, and if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to go ahead and get an early start up to Helen Lake, and you guys can just catch up to me there. So he leaves 50-50 Flats for Helen Lake. Just so you know, Helen Lake, not a lake, just a flat area that's a good spot to pitch a tent. Now, for a spring-summer hike like these guys are doing, the temperatures are usually around 60 degrees, and the weather on that particular day is fantastic. Very little wind, full sunshine, just ideal. Carl is wearing 2 or 3 layers of clothes, including a rust-colored jacket, ski pants, and hiking shoes with crampons, which are just spikes that you can clip to your boots to give you better traction on the snow and the ice. He also has a backpack with food and water. And at that elevation, if there isn't snow on the ground, there's very little vegetation. There's a few trees here and there, but for the most part, if you just look up, you'll see your next destination. The trail may meander a little, but it's basically just grass and rocks. Now, to be clear, if you are going from the 50-50 Flats to Helen Lake, there is no way to get off trail. It is just a straight shot up inside a gully. If you fall, you will only slide back down to 50-50 Flats. There are no crevices, there's no woods or underbrush, the trail does not split off, there are no caves. There is nowhere to get lost between Camp 50-50 and Helen Lake. Nowhere. But regardless of what is or isn't possible, when Milton and Barry get up to Helen Lake, Carl's not there. He leaves the 50-50 Flats and just vanishes. Not a trace. No clothes, no backpacks, nothing. And at this time of year, there are always people at Helen Lake. That's the place that most people stop to camp for the night before the final trek to the summit. But no one saw him there. By that afternoon, a search is launched, headed up by Grizz Adams, a guy with 400 search and rescue operations under his belt. The search includes both the U.S. Forest Service and the National Guard, with both the National Guard and the state police contributing helicopters, at least some of which using infrared sensors, or FLIR, scanning completely open territory. And infrared picks up body temperature, so if anything warmer than the ground temperature is there, the infrared sensors would pick it up. But you guessed it, nothing. The next morning, 50 people, including rangers, volunteers, and scent dogs, start searching the trails, including a few climbers that are helicoptered to the top of the mountain to search starting at the top and working their way down, just in case Carl kept going beyond Helen Lake. But any experienced hiker knows to stick to the plan, and the plan was hike to Helen Lake. So Carl should have stopped right there. That was the rendezvous point. That was the plan. Meet there before starting the next stage of the climb. But no one finds a thing. No snowy footprints heading off the trail, and the scent dogs pick up nothing. Grizz Adams, the head of the search and rescue operation, actually spoke with David Paulides, who most of you know as the author of the Missing 411 book series. And Grizz told David In 35 years, I have never had this happen to me. We were all over that mountain. He was not on the mountain. Now, as far as what happened to Carl, Grizz had this to say. That's the million-dollar question. He either went up it or in it, but he is not on it. In addition, a spokeswoman for the Siskiyou Sheriff's Department released this. We've just looked everywhere we can look, and we just don't know where else to look. And it's not like he's out in the middle of the deep woods in the middle of nowhere. In fact, there were a bunch of other people around Helen Lake at the time of his disappearance, and no one sees him? I'm starting to think harder about those Lemurians. So what happened to him? Well, there are a couple of options. Suicide by mountain? Not likely. He had a great family life and was tackling the very last piece he needed to complete his bucket list goal of summiting all 58 county peaks. Maybe some kind of altitude-induced dementia or other health-related event? Well, things like that are not uncommon for a man of his age, but even if something did happen to him, where would he go? If he collapses on the trail, his friends would find him. And if he lapses into some kind of fugue state where he has no idea where he is and wanders off, the infrared sensors would find him. Animal attack. Nope. There are no large mammals that live at this high of an altitude. Foul play? Maybe. But it's determined that neither of his friends have any motive for killing him. Not to mention the fact that you would have to be pretty stupid to kill someone at that spot, considering there is absolutely no place to hide a body. In the 25 years that have passed, not a trace of Carl has ever been found. This is one of those total head-scratcher cases where being taken by the Lemurians is about the only option left. Now, if there is a whole civilization of people living within the mountain, they are going to have to get out of the mountain on occasion, right? And how would they do that? Well, we already know their vehicle of choice is the cigar-shaped airship. Sounds funny, but there have been UFO sightings around Mount Shasta for over 100 years. Of the top 300 UFO hotspots in the world, Mount Shasta is ranked 13th. Some people have seen metallic objects hovering in the air, while others report light formations around the mountain peak, so way higher than a normal drone can fly. And they just disappear. One of the more widely known recent sightings is the flying jellyfish of 2008. The Mount Shasta Herald reported that the residents of the McLeod area saw what looks like a giant glowing jellyfish hovering over the mountain. It made no noise, but it looked like it had a fire burning inside of it. We don't have any pictures of this one, but last year, someone captured this footage while looking out the window of an airplane. And sometimes people see flying objects fly right into the side of the mountain, like it's flying right through solid rock. I told you those Lemurians were getting bored inside that mountain. Mount Shasta is one of the few places in the world that can boast a very unique weather phenomena called lenticular cloud formation. And when you see these pictures, it's easy to see why stories abound about UFO activity on the mountain. But the reality of UFOs around the mountain is actually very well documented. The National UFO Reporting Center, or NUFORC, alone has 58 reports dating back to just 2004 that just have the name Shasta in them. So it doesn't include anything that someone might have entered with just their city name, like Azalea, Black Butte, or Weed.
Ah, man. That's some heavy shit.
One great sighting was reported to NUFORC as happening in either 1964 or 1965. A bunch of 5th and 6th graders are outside for a school assembly in what is now the city of Shasta Lake. The weather's nice and the sky is clear. There are about 45 people gathered, including students, secretaries, and teachers, when a silver disc-shaped craft flies over the school grounds with no noise, very low, just above the tall pine trees. It glides over them and appears to land in some trees behind the school. The teachers get everyone inside and to their classrooms, where the kids just sit in silence, and they're told that the sheriff has been called. The witness then sees a man walk by their classroom window, which is on the opposite side of the school from where the main school doors and the principal's office are located. So presumably the place that the sheriff would go. The man is not wearing a law enforcement uniform, but instead is wearing a black suit and carrying a briefcase. Men in black! And walking in the direction of where the craft would have landed. At 2 p.m., the bell rings and everyone is dismissed for the day. The witness and their friend immediately head out to where they think this thing must have landed and meet some friends who are already on their way back. The friends tell them that the ship is gone, but the witness and their friend go to check it out anyway. They find a roughly 40-foot diameter ring with burn marks along the outside. Later, they even bring their mom to the area, who witnesses the ring as well. And even years later, the witness says they returned to that spot to find nothing growing there. Now, I find it interesting that most modern reports of alien encounters describe aliens that are about 4 feet tall, but Lemurians are rumored to be 10 to 15 feet tall. In fact, in 1930, a humanoid skeleton over 8 feet tall was discovered 12 feet deep under a lava flow in Shasta County, just south of Mount Shasta. And we still have the newspaper accounts to prove it. And Native American folklore says a race of giants existed on the earth for thousands of years, but were suddenly wiped out in a great flood. Why is it always a flood? Were they Lemurians? Or are they the ancestors of the giants we know today? It's December 1999 in Northern California, so it's no real surprise when one day it starts snowing. But it snows enough throughout the morning that young Tyler's school in the town of Mount Shasta eventually throws in the towel and closes for the day, shipping Tyler and all the rest of the kids home before the snow gets too deep to do so safely. And I guarantee from experience that every single kid in that school is praying that the snow keeps coming so they don't have to go to school the next day either. When Tyler gets home, surprise, his dad has the rest of the day off too and says, "Hey, Tyler, want to go sledding?" Well, of course, that's a stupid question to ask a young boy with a free afternoon and a snowstorm. So his dad has done a lot of cross-country skiing around different areas of the mountain and knew that area really well. So he picks out a great spot for sledding, and they grab an inflatable saucer and a runner sled. Runner sleds are those old-fashioned wooden sleds with metal runners on the bottom, and the runners in the front turn just enough to let you steer a little bit, so if you're heading right for something, you can at least avoid a collision. And so they get to this hill, and it's still snowing pretty good, which is probably why nobody else was out there. Tyler and his dad have a great time climbing up, sledding down, trading sleds, just pure little boy joy. And somewhere around half an hour, 45 minutes in, Tyler and his dad are both at the top of the hill. Tyler sees his dad staring down into the tree line that's at the bottom of the hill and to the left. At the bottom to the right, it's clear, and that's where the cars would park. So he sees his dad staring into the forest. And he doesn't know it, but his dad sees a dark shape moving just inside the tree line. Tyler turns his head and tries to see what his dad is seeing, but he doesn't see anything for a second, but then he does. Whatever this thing is that his dad has been watching, it steps out of the tree line and into the snowy clearing to the left of the sled run, about 250 feet away. It was on 2 feet with broad shoulders, standing perfectly still. Tyler and his dad are both staring and squinting at it, trying to figure out what exactly that they're looking at. Tyler's paging through his catalog of known animals in his brain and is coming up empty. So he looks at his dad and waits for him to say something like, "Oh, look, there's a bear," or "Oh, look, there's a mountain lion." Just then, this thing drops to all fours and starts running at them, coming up the slope from the base of the hill, looking like it's coming right towards them. Tyler's dad is still staring at it, trying to figure out what it is. And finally, Tyler asks him, "Dad, what is that?" And right at that moment, his dad turns, picks Tyler up, puts him on the runner sled, gets on the back of the sled, and takes off down the hill, not even bothering to grab the other sled. Sounds crazy, but they really didn't have anywhere else to go. The back of the hill slopes off really deep, and at the bottom, there's a fence. Outrunning this, whatever it is their only option. So they are tearing down this slope, and this thing is coming up from the left at an intercept angle towards them, while they are angling to the right towards the clearing where the car is parked. Tyler's dad, with Tyler between his legs, is steering the sled with his feet, riding the line between turning right as sharply as he can and turning too sharply, which will flip the sled over. Obviously, suboptimal. Tyler doesn't even want to know what is happening, so he covers his face with his hands until the need to know just becomes too much and he peeks between his fingers. He sees this thing coming right towards them from the left with large black shoulders, still running on all fours. And it's close enough now that he can see that what looked before like front legs are actually arms. It has shiny black hair, a big brow ridge on its flat face, a thin, wide mouth with long black hair around it, big, round eyes, and it's galloping right at them. His dad yells, "Get out of here!" as they pass it, barely beating it to the interception point. They were so close that Tyler thought this thing was going to reach out and just knock them both off the sled. But it didn't. They continue down to the bottom of the hill where Tyler's dad pushes him off the sled, stands up, picks Tyler up by the arm, and they both start running, leaving the sled behind. More snow has fallen in the tracks that they had made coming in, and Tyler is running as fast as he can, but the snow is thick and deep. His dad just says, "Don't look back." Tyler keeps running, but he can't help it. He looks back, and he sees the thing, and it looks like it's stopped, and it's heading back up the hill. He keeps running, and after a few seconds, looks again. Now, it's at the top of the hill, pacing back and forth, standing upright again. As they're both running towards the car, they see coming up this small slope some men that look like they're in the military, including guns. His dad says, "Hello," as one of the men steps forward ahead of the others and starts talking to his dad. They both turn and start walking away from Tyler, so he can't quite hear them, but it sounds like his dad is telling him what just happened. The two men chat for a minute or so, and the military man gestures for the other soldiers to move out. They're going in the wrong direction. Tyler is just about to say something when his dad turns and looks at him, telling Tyler with his look, "Be quiet, don't say anything." Tyler shuts his mouth, and the men continue on their way. Then the lead military guy starts patting down his dad, looking for something. And at first, Tyler thinks he's looking for weapons, but the more he thinks about it, he realizes the guy's not looking for weapons. He's looking for a camera or anything else that could blow up this cover-up. He finds nothing, lets him go, and Tyler and his dad walk back to their car and go home. And it isn't until some time later that Tyler's dad tells him that he deliberately sent those soldiers in the wrong direction. He said that when they were coming down the slope on the sled, he looked in the face of this animal, this Sasquatch, running on all fours, and saw in its face this overwhelming fear, and that this thing just wanted to be left alone. And we would certainly be remiss if we didn't also include Sasquatch's close cousin, Batsquatch. The stories of Batsquatch begin with the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington in the 1980s. But one day in 2009, Paul Dale Roberts from Haunted and Paranormal Investigations International gets a phone call. The caller says that he and his friend were hiking around Mount Shasta, and out of one of the crevices in the side of the mountain flies out this big creature, as tall as a man, as stocky as Hulk Hogan, and leathery wings with a span of about 50 feet. This thing was so freaky that even with a camera in his hands, he was too freaked out to get a picture. Now I hear you yelling out there, "What? No picture?" Well, once you come face to face with a Batsquatch, let me know how you react. At first, he thought maybe it was a pterodactyl, but after looking up a picture of a pterodactyl, he says that's not it. The head is more like that of a bat or a fox. It was flying or gliding really fast and finally flew into a clump of trees and vanished. And for all you Dogman fans out there who probably think I've forgotten about you, I have not. This little tale comes from Redditor 420 Blazeit. He and his wife are driving south on Highway 97, which is on the north side of Mount Shasta. It's around midnight, and they're driving through a heavily wooded area with no streetlights, so all they have is the car's headlights. They round a corner and see something fast and low to the ground dart across the street about 50 to 60 yards ahead of them. But that brief moment is enough for him to see the glowing animal eyes and a body that is the size and shape of a big dog. The body wasn't 100% clear because the car's headlights hadn't quite reached that section of the road yet, but that does mean that the glowing eyes are not glowing from eye shine. They're just glowing. He asks his wife, "Did you see that?" And his wife says, "Yup." So when they get to the exact point in the road where the animal had crossed, he slows the car and they both look to see if there's anything there. Is there a Dogman? Nope, something weirder. There's a man dressed in army fatigues walking down the road. He doesn't even look at them. He just keeps walking. It's pitch black and he doesn't have any type of light with him. He is only lit up by their headlights. They both get full body chills and are properly creeped out. Now, when we're talking about these areas that just seem to be focal points of high strangeness, we expect to hear stories of UFOs and cryptid sightings. But Shasta also has its fair share of tales that are just plain weird. In 2011, a man from Los Angeles is hiking the Pacific Crest Trail near Mount Shasta when he hears the beautiful singing of a woman's voice. Now, he follows the voice and becomes lost in the woods, only to be abducted and taken to a dark chamber in a cave. Once there, he is stripped naked and is approached by a tall woman with striking, beautiful blue eyes and bizarre, strange clothing. She gives him a gift, some secret information. And this guy was gone for weeks. When he finally does reappear, he believes he is the 10th incarnation of Vishnu, a messianic Hindu god. He changed his name to Lord Kelki and never divulges the secret information given to him by the mysterious woman. Another strange event is in an article written by Andrew Thomas and published in the Australian Flying Saucer Review in 1962. A very curious event happened around the mountain in 1931. A forest fire was raging around the mountain, threatening to consume everything in sight, when out of nowhere, a foggy mist appears and advances in the direction of the fire line. And when the mist meets the fire stops in its tracks and is contained while it either burns itself out or is able to be extinguished. Once the fire is out, locals could see a clear line of demarcation where the mist had protected the forest around the mountain. Let's not forget that Mount Shasta is also the location of events that are just weirdly terrifying. Brent Swancer, writing for Mysterious Universe, reports a tale sent to him personally. Back in the 1980s, a man decides to take advantage of the beautiful sunny day and goes for a walk on one of the hiking trails in the area. As he's strolling along, the picture-perfect weather turns gray and sour on a dime. And he's just standing there wondering what the hell is going on with the weather when he sees a thick, soupy mist coming from the forest in front of him, spreading through the brush on the ground. And he's just standing there trying to process this misty mass that looks like it came out of a 1950s horror film. 2 deer come bolting from the trees, with one of the deer flying right past him just a few feet away, totally ignoring him. The other one stops in the same clearing he's in and just kind of freezes. Then this mist, which had just kind of been hugging the ground, speeds up. When it reaches the deer's feet, the deer goes into convulsions and falls to the ground. That's when he sees this bigger wall of fog coming from the trees that heads straight for the deer. The fog is about as thick and dense as fog can get, more of like a blob-like mass, and it stops right at the fallen deer. After a few minutes, the fog dissipates, the mist rolls away, and the sky is bright and sunny again. But no deer. It's gone. No body, blood, bones, nothing. It didn't get up and run away, because he would have seen that. It never left that fog. It was just erased. And now he wonders what would have happened if there were no deer and it was just him that was in that clearing. And now that we all feel like we need a spiritual shower, let's talk about the huge influx of spiritualism to the area. I mean, all the regular religions are there. The Catholics, the Lutherans, the Baptists, etc. The Buddhists actually built an abbey there. Hindus are there. And the occasional cult, allegedly. But probably the most talked about religion, at least when you're talking about Mount Shasta, is the I Am Activity movement. In the 1930s, Guy Ballard, a mining engineer, was exploring Mount Shasta looking for a branch of the Great White Brotherhood known as the Brotherhood of Mount Shasta, which is a New Age spiritual belief system, when he stops for a break and takes a cup to get some fresh spring water. As he does, an electrifying jolt runs through his body. He turns around to see a man standing there, just looking like another hiker. But Guy has the feeling that this is no ordinary man. The man tells him, "Give me your cup, and I will give you something to drink that is more refreshing than spring water." Guy hands over his cup, and the water is instantly changed into a white milky liquid. Guy drinks the white liquid and feels an instant surge of energy. And the man tells him that what he just drank comes directly from the universal supply. It is life. Omnipresent life. The man goes on to reveal himself as being the one and only Count of Saint Germain, which is a name some of you might recognize because he's pretty famous in the paranormal world as the immortal man who never ages beyond 45 years old. Guy and his wife Edna go on to take the teachings of Saint Germain and use them to found the I Am Activity movement and the Saint Germain Foundation. It wasn't a small movement either. At its peak, it had over 1 million followers. But then Guy dies and some followers leave. And then Edna is sued for copyright infringement and some more followers leave. But the I Am Activity movement is still around. And if you're so inclined, you can go to see the I Am Reading Room in Mount Shasta City. Interesting note, that copyright infringement case, they were sued by the family of Frederick S. Oliver. Remember? The guy who channeled Philos the Atlantean? Well, apparently, the Ballards lifted some of their materials straight from Frederick Oliver's book, A Dweller on Two Planets. But get this, the case was thrown out because in the foreword of the book, written by Frederick himself, he says that he is not the author, merely the secretary chosen by the Lemurians to write down their message. And even the copyright of the book lists him as the proprietor, not as the author. So, if he didn't write it, then the Ballards didn't infringe on anything. Wow! One thing that cannot be denied is that there are a whole lot of people out there who feel a spiritual connection to this mountain, which is believed to be one of the 7 sacred peaks on Earth. A full 25 to 50% of the tourists who visit the mountain and the city of Mount Shasta come looking for some kind of spiritual experience, also known as spiritual tourists. And there are plenty of companies in the area to help them, offering guided vision quests, shamanic awakenings, vortex visits, and crystal collections. The area is home to more than 100 different spiritual sects or religions and dozens of New Age businesses. Many of those tourists never leave, instead opting to heed the call of the mountain. Louis Elbinger, a retiree who started a donation-based tea shop in Mount Shasta, says, "I was called. The mountain called me. When I'm walking through the forest, I feel like I'm walking through a cathedral." Few places on this earth speak to everyone, natural and supernatural alike, like Mount Shasta. And if you ever do decide to go visit this breathtaking place of energy and mystery, make sure you heed the warning of the local natives. Do not go above the tree line. That area is reserved for the sky people. Episode number 3 of our top 5 episodes is a legendary fan favorite that reminds us all that life can turn not only on a dime, but on a bullet. Joe, it's your average Joe. After serving 6 years in the Army, he settles down with a wife and an average job and spends his free time doing what average Michigan men do: little hunting, little target shooting. By the time he's in his 50s, that average job is as a short haul trucker. And on an average summer day in 2017, Joe is traveling his regular route, delivering about 43,000 pounds of paper from Traverse City, Michigan. It's about 7 p.m. on a picture-perfect June evening. The sun is shining and the temperature is just warm enough that opening the windows on the day truck's cab brings in cool, fresh air. As Joe's driving along the 2-lane highway through the Manistee National Forest, he notices a leak in an air hose on the trailer. Not a big deal. He carries tools with him so he can take care of small problems like this himself, so he doesn't have to wait for someone to come and fix it for him. He just happens to be right at a snowplow turnaround where the road is a little wider, so he can pull off the road enough to not obstruct traffic. So he pulls the truck to the side, grabs his tool bag, and jumps down from the cab. Little does he know that this is his last average moment on Earth. He gets a bad feeling as soon as his feet hit the pavement. Something's not right. That hair standing up on the back of your neck, not right. He looks round, but can't see anything wrong, so he just lets it go and focuses on fixing the truck. Joe locates a small crack in the hose by the back brake chamber and starts to fix it. If he's lucky, the repair will last him at least until the end of his run. As he's fixing the crack, he hears some rustling and small branches breaking just inside the woodline of the forest, which is set back about 30 yards from the road. He hears a strange vocalization, like nothing he's ever heard before in all of his years as a hunter. Whatever it is, doesn't sound natural. But he doesn't think too much about it. It is a pretty wild area, and Joe's one of those guys who's not really afraid of anything. But that feeling of dread in his stomach is not getting any better. He looks over towards where the sounds are coming from and can see something moving, where light and shadow seem to be bouncing off something moving around, but it's too dark in there to be able to see what it is. Knowing full well he is in black bear country, he hurries to finish the fix, which takes him all of 5 minutes, and hops back up into the truck, not wanting to take the chance of tangling with a bear. He starts the truck and checks the pressure gauge. Looks like the fix is holding for the moment, so he gets the truck in motion once again. And that's not as easy as it sounds. He stopped at the bottom of a long incline, and his load is really heavy, so it takes a while to get that kind of weight moving again. But at least he's moving. As the truck is slowly gaining speed, Joe checks his driver's side mirror, looking for traffic as he moves back into the lane. He's clear. In fact, so quiet tonight that he doesn't think a single car has passed him the entire time he was stopped. He easily moves back onto the road and is on his way. But then, something's off. As Joe is looking ahead, driving the truck, he notices in his peripheral vision that the light coming from his right side mirror, so the passenger side, has gone dark. Joe glances over to see what's going on over on that side of the truck. And what he sees right outside of his open cab window scars his very soul from that moment on. Right outside the window is a creature with the face of what looks like a wolf, but it's so unbelievably big that it takes up the entire window. It's running alongside the truck on 2 legs at a seemingly leisurely pace. And when I say big, I mean this thing is actually stooping down while running along to look inside the window at Joe. Keep in mind, Joe is over 6 feet tall, and by his own estimates, his own head is sitting at about 9 full feet off the ground. So for this thing to have to stoop down to look in the window means it, standing upright, would be in the neighborhood of 10 or more feet tall. Time slows down as Joe's mind tries to understand just how it is that he can be looking at what he can only comprehend is some kind of werewolf just outside his truck window. He's heard of Bigfoot before and knows for a fact that they are a real thing. He actually saw one himself when he was in the army. But what he is looking at right now does not exist in his reality. He's never even heard of a Dogman, so werewolf is the closest thing his mind can come up with, as this creature is just trotting alongside the truck, which is up to about 25 miles an hour at this point. Joe can see its broad, human-like shoulders and its arms dangling in front of it. He watches it lift its left arm. Its claws appear on the bottom edge of the open window and scratch the paint and rubber seal, almost as if it's testing to see if the window is open. The window is open! Joe's head explodes with the realization that his window is wide open and starts fumbling to find the switch to close it, followed quickly by his second realization that with this thing, wouldn't matter anyway. Whatever this thing is, it's solid black with a thick mane of hair, like a lion's mane, starting at its ears and flowing all the way down to its shoulders. And its head is so big, like a grizzly bear, that Joe estimates that it would fill an entire laundry basket. Its tongue is as big as a cow's tongue. Its hands look like human hands, or maybe raccoon hands, with what might have been opposable thumbs, but they also had pads on the underside like a dog. Its claws are also solid black, about the thickness of a cigar, and in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 inches long. Its fingers are 8 to 10 inches long, and the hand itself is so big that if you splayed it out, it would cover the size of the truck's steering wheel. That's somewhere between 18 to 22 inches across. It had tufts of hair at the tops of its ears, and the hair seemed to have a silvery, almost translucent effect at the ends. Its face is pretty close to that of a German shepherd or wolf, but with a slightly shorter snout. Everything is black except for the teeth and the eyes. And the teeth are brilliant white, like it never missed a dentist appointment white, about the thickness of Joe's thumb, and also in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 inches long, tapering down to a nice point. He can even see a scar on its muzzle. And its eyes are a bright yellow or amber color. All in all, Joe says if this thing hadn't been a walking nightmare, would have been a really beautiful creature. Its eyes aren't like regular animal eyes. They seem to have an intelligence behind them, and they're darting all around like it's trying to size up the situation and Joe inside the truck. It looks right in Joe's eyes, and Joe immediately gets a message. He doesn't know whether it's some kind of paranormal mind speak or his interpretation of the situation, but Joe hears in his head,
"I gotcha, and there's nothing you can do about it."
Joe is desperately trying to keep his mind, which is moving at speeds heretofore unknown to him, enough in check to keep the truck on the road and going straight as it continues up the hill, as his subconscious wakes up and returns a thought back to the monster. "Oh, you think I can't do anything about it? Well, watch this." Years of army training and countless weekends of target shooting kick into gear. And without even realizing what he is doing, Joe reaches into the space between his seat and his cooler and pulls out his Smith & Wesson Governor 410 revolver. In the same instant, the creature's face seems to recognize what's in Joe's hand. He fires 2 shots at its head at point-blank range. And his gun doesn't have just any old ammo. He has it loaded with solid copper hollow point maximum expansion bullets that open up to 1.5 inches wide spinning blades. One shot finds its mark either through the eye socket or temple area, and the Dogman goes down instantly, like he had just hit a clothesline. Joe quickly checks his side mirror, where he can see a cloud of dust as the Dogman hits the gravel on the side of the road with its arms and legs stiff as a board. And he recognizes from his years of hunting the telltale sign of a brain shot. He watches it mow down weeds as it slides down the embankment and sees the full body for the first time. It is literally as big as a horse, with arms and legs about as big around as Joe's waist, and he guesses it must weigh in at about 1,000 pounds. Its torso is pretty human looking until you get to the long tail, which is about 5 feet long. Its feet look like canine feet, but a little bit longer than a dog paw and rounder, and they are about the size of a dinner plate. He keeps driving with a million things going through his head as his ears are ringing from the shots fired inside the cab. Am I losing my mind? Did I just jump into some other reality? But then he thinks, wait, I gotta see it. I gotta know if this really did just happen. And if it really did just happen, I gotta know that it's dead. Now, whether that means he has to shoot it again or run it over with his truck, he doesn't really care. But he couldn't live with himself if he knew he'd let this thing live. He has to make sure it is dead. So at the top of the hill that he's been driving up this whole time, there's a small picnic area. It's not meant to be a semi-truck turnaround, but he does it anyway, sacrificing a few small tree limbs in the process. Takes him maybe 5 minutes or so to get turned around, and as he comes back down the hill, he sees the exact spot where the werewolf thing went down. The weeds are all smashed and flattened. Can't miss a big black lump the size of a horse, right? But it's gone. What is there is a Jeep with a couple standing by the side of the road. Being more than a little concerned for their welfare, Joe stops the truck and as nonchalantly as possible asks them, "Need any help?" The couple seem a little standoffish or skittish, and they just tell Joe, "No, we're fine. We just stopped because we thought we saw a couple of really big bears or something fighting and one dragging the other into the woods." And Joe looks at the spot and he can clearly see a path through the weeds where something has been dragged into the woods. And he gets the distinct impression that what they saw weren't bears, and that they wanted to tell them that they weren't bears, but couldn't bring themselves to actually say what they saw. And Joe asks, "So you saw 2 of them?" And they answer, "Oh yeah. And he thinks, "Oh, good God, there's more than one of these things around? Is there a whole pack?" So after exchanging a few more pleasantries, there's not much more to say, so they exchange goodbyes and Joe starts to pull away. But as he does, he notices a few odd things about their Jeep. First, it had white plates, which are not Michigan plates. These are government plates. And they have a shotgun at the ready sitting up in the back seat. Interesting, but whatever. All Joe wants to do right now is get home. He probably shouldn't have been driving a truck in that state of mind, but too bad. He certainly isn't going to stick around or park anywhere near there. He is getting home as fast as he can. After that day, Joe zombies his way through life for about a week before he can pull himself together and re-engage in life to any degree. He just keeps thinking that it had to have been God guiding his hand that day, not him. That if he had stopped to think about what he was doing, he would have screwed it up. And all that would be left is an empty truck on the side of the road with a missing driver. In his mind, this is probably the most terrifying thing that anybody could ever go through. Worse than any combat situation, because at least there you know what you're dealing with and you're in a reality that you comprehend. Joe has never been afraid of anything except this thing. He doesn't understand why it didn't get him, because if it wanted him, it could have easily gotten him when he stopped to fix the truck. He saw it. He just didn't know at the time what he was seeing. Joe tells no one, and for the next 6 months to a year, tries to manage the nightmares and the PTSD all by himself before finally confessing his secret to his wife, who says, "Why didn't you tell me?" Joe's response, "Who's gonna believe me?" He also confides in his sister, who's way more familiar with cryptids than he is, who immediately tells him, "You need to share your story." Takes Joe about another year before he can gather the fortitude to go public. But when he does, he reaches out to Lance Hightower from the Cryptid Brothers Investigation of Oklahoma to tell his story. But he's not quite ready to go full on public yet. So he tells his story to Lance, who narrates it on his Monster 911 podcast. That's when a whole different kind of trouble starts. About 3 months later, he's at a scale house where semis pull in to have their truck weight checked when the state patrol tell him, "Get comfortable. The feds want to talk to you." Joe has no idea why the feds would want to talk to him, but it's not like he's got much choice, so he waits. After a few hours, a black sedan with white government plates, just like the Jeep, pulls up and a couple of very pissed off federal officials in dark suits come sauntering up, exuding anger and irritation and flashing badges so fast that Joe can't even see where they're from. They say, "You killed our asset." Joe's head starts racing, trying to figure out what in the hell these guys are talking about. The only thing he's killed in the last couple of years is that That thing was your asset? And now you're mad because I killed it? Obviously, somebody heard his story come out on the podcast, and these guys are now assigned to damage control. They want him to stop talking. But they're not done. They go on to tell him something like, "We can do a lot of things to make sure you don't talk about this anymore. Can't keep a trucking job if you have a dirty drug test. Those dirty drug tests could happen. Might even have something happen with your money." They've done their homework and must know that Joe has a concealed carry license because they tell him, "We need your gun and your phone." Joe gives them his phone and the rifle he has in the truck, but not the gun he used to kill the Dogman. After playing bad guy for a while, they give him his phone back. And Joe asks, "What about my gun?" And they basically tell him, "Don't call us, we'll call you, and you'll be lucky if you even get it back. And keep your mouth shut about all of this, or we can make your life miserable." With that, they let him go. But just a few days later, Joe's bank accounts are frozen. And they don't stay frozen for long, but it's enough for Joe to get the message. Obviously, these guys can do whatever they want, and now they have his rifle. Who knows what future crime scene that could show up in? So Joe shuts up. For a while. But time is a funny thing. It has the ability to smooth the sharp edges of a painful situation and shrink its influence on you until it is small enough that you can see past it and see a different outlook. And that's exactly what happened to Joe. Over time, and with lots of deep soul searching, he finally and fully realizes that these things are real and they're out there and they're hurting people, and he has a duty and an obligation to let people know. He needs to at least try to warn us so we can be prepared both physically and mentally for a confrontation when we head into the woods. And he needs us to know that these things are just like any other living being in that they can be killed. Kind of important information. So he starts telling his story to people and doing interviews with Dogman researchers like Barton Nunnally and Jeff Nadolny on his Dogman and Paranormal Research channel, knowing there are a lot of people who are going to think he's full of crap, but some won't. Some will hear him. Some will listen. And maybe they'll have an advantage in knowing what's out there, an advantage that he never had. But he still has questions. How many of these things are out there? How much would something this big, the size of a full-grown horse, need to eat every day? Where did the body go? It was way too big for one or even two people to drag away. Personally, if other dogmen came in and dragged the body away, that shows a level of intelligence that scares the crap out of me. And are they like other canines that hunt in packs? One thought that disturbs Joe to this day is a nagging feeling that the creature he saw wasn't the one he needed to worry about, but just the distraction. And that by being both prepared and well-trained, with a little help from God to boot, he screwed up the plan to distract him from his right while the real threat approached from his left. He never saw anything on his left, but that question, that feeling, still haunts him today. And what about the feds? Well, they certainly kept tabs on Joe for a while, going so far as to even put a tracker on his car. And One day, out of the blue, Joe finds an unfamiliar box in the back of his pickup. What's in it? His rifle. So who knows? They may still be out there watching from a distance even today. But I think the cat's out of the bag on this one, because Joe is done being scared. And I think he has the better weapon, the truth. The runner-up for the top video of 2024 is an episode that gives us a peek into the complexity of human nature when dealing with the unknowns, both natural and spiritual. Some of you may already know the story of the miracle at Fatima, and some of you may not. But no matter what you think of the miracle part, just hang on. Because as soon as you think the story is over, that's when it takes a sharp left into places even fiction writers are afraid to go. At the dawn of the 20th century, Portugal is a mess. After overthrowing their 800-year-old monarchy in 1910, they flounder for a while. And when I say flounder, I mean 45 different governments in 16 years. That's a new government every 3 months. What they end up with is a government that hates the Catholic Church and passes laws specifically meant to drive the church out of Portugal. On top of all of that, they managed to pick a fight with Germany in March of 1916, and Portugal enters World War I. All of that history is to paint you a backdrop for the events that transpire in May of 1917 that will go on to change the Catholic Church forever. Our tale starts in the summer of 1916. 3 children, Lucia dos Santos, who's 9 years old, and her 2 cousins, Jacinta, who's 6, and Francisco, who's 8, are out in the fields tending sheep. It starts to rain a bit, so the children seek shelter in a small cave, eat their lunch, pray the rosary, and then just hang out for a bit playing jacks. When a huge wind starts to blow so hard, it's shaking the trees. The kids look up from their game, wondering what kind of storm is whipping up, and see a light above the trees, whiter than snow, moving towards them. As the light moves closer, the form of a man starts to take shape. The man says to the stunned children,
"Fear not. I am the angel of peace. Pray with me."
After praying with the children, the angel tells them,
"The hearts of Jesus and Mary are attentive to the voice of your supplications."
At which point, he takes his leave. The children are speechless, and after praying for a little longer, they go home and tell some of their friends, but they get such grief in return, they stop telling anybody. It takes a while, but they eventually return to being normal little kids, with one exception. They are now inseparable. The angel of peace would visit them 3 more times that summer, each time leaving the children excited but drained of their strength at the same time. But it also transforms the idea of God's love into something they could literally feel. They go from typical 6, 8, and 9-year-olds to children of outstanding devotion to God. Fast forward to the next summer, specifically May 13th, 1917. The children are out in the fields once again in an area called the Cova de Areia, having a great time building a castle out of rocks on a spectacularly beautiful clear day, when a bright shaft of light flashes in front of them, so bright that they thought it was lightning. So even though there's not a cloud in the bright blue sky, they gather up the sheep and start heading home, thinking a storm has to be coming. As they're heading down the hill, another flash of light stops them, and they see the most beautiful woman they have ever seen, dressed all in white, more brilliant than the sun, hovering over a holm oak tree. "Fear not, I will not harm you."
"Where are you from?"
"I am from heaven."
"What do you want of me?"
"I come to ask you to come here for 6 consecutive months on the 13th day at the same hour. I will tell you later who I am and what I want.
And I? Am I too going to heaven?
Yes, you shall.
And Jacinta?
Yes.
And Francisco?
He too shall go, but he must say many rosaries. Then the lady asked the children, "Do you want to offer yourselves to God, to endure all the sufferings that he may choose to send you as an act of reparation for the sins by which he is offended, and as supplication for the conversion of sinners?" Promptly, Lucia responds for all three.
Yes, we want to.
Then you are going to suffer a great deal, but the grace of God will be your comfort. After telling the children to pray the rosary, the lady in white rises back up into the sky. The children spend the rest of the afternoon talking about the stunning apparition. Interestingly enough, Lucia and Jacinta can hear and see the lady, but Francisco can only see her and has to ask the girls what she said. They also notice that after the visits from the Angel of Peace, they were always exhausted, but this time they feel full of energy and joy. When they finally head home for the day, they all agree not to tell anyone. They'd already learned that lesson from the grief they got from telling people about seeing the Angel of Peace. But poor little Jacinta just can't resist, and she tells her mom about everything that happened to them. Her mom just can't resist telling the neighbors about her own children being blessed enough to be visited by none other than Our Lady herself. And word spreads. When it gets back to Lucia's mother, she's furious at the thought that one of her children is a liar and tells Lucia that she's really in for it if she does not recant her story and tell the truth. So the next day, Lucia is sad because her own mother thinks she's a liar, and little Jacinta is sad because she broke her promise of silence to Lucia. Seems like Our Lady's warning that the children will suffer is already coming true. But life goes on for another month. June 13th rolls around, and while the rest of the village goes to church to celebrate the feast of St. Anthony, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco, and about 50 other people from nearby villages, because word is already getting out, head out to the Cova de Aria to see Our Lady in White. And the Lady in White does not disappoint. Around noon, right on schedule, the lady appears to the children.
I would like to ask you to take us to heaven.
Yes, I will take Jacinta and Francisco soon. You, however, are to stay here a longer time.
Am I going to stay here alone?
Lucia asks, full of sadness at the thought of losing her beloved cousins. No, my daughter, I will never leave you. The other people who had come to see the Lady in White can hear Lucia speaking to her, but all they hear in return is something that sounds like a very gentle voice, like the gentle humming of a bee, but they can't understand what is being said. The lady reminds the children to pray the rosary and then leaves. Witnesses report that when the lady leaves, they only see a small wispy cloud rising toward the east and a hissing sound like a distant rocket. The children spend the next month being constantly harassed. Lucia's entire family still thinks she's lying. It gets so bad that Lucia has been convinced by all the naysayers that she isn't seeing the Immaculate Mary. She is entertaining the devil, which makes her decide not to go again. However, when she wakes up on the morning of July 13th, her heart is changed and all three children head out for the Cova de Aria together. This time they are joined by their mothers who follow them in secret just to make sure they don't get hurt in the crowd. And Jacinta and Francisco's father, T, who believes every word because he knows these children are not liars. The Lady in White comes again right on time and appears to the children. T, who is led through the crowd of 5,000 people by his fellow villagers so he can stand next to his children, says, I began to hear a hum like a fly within an empty jug, but I did not hear a word. This is when the lady in white tells the children a secret in 3 parts, now known as the 3 secrets. The first secret is a glimpse of hell. Plunged in this fire were demons and souls of the damned in human form, like transparent burning embers, all blackened and burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration, now raised into the air by the flames that issued from within themselves, together with great clouds of smoke, now falling back on every side like sparks in huge fires, without weight or equilibrium, amid shrieks and groans of pains and despair, which horrified us and made us tremble with fear. The second secret has to do with saving sinners with the establishment of a devotion to her Immaculate Heart. She tells them the war will be ending soon, but if people do not stop sinning, a worse one is going to break out in the reign of Pius XI. She tells Lucia that when you see the night sky illuminated by an unknown light, know that it is a sign from God that the next war is coming. And I'll be back to ask for the consecration of Russia. If sinners do what I ask and pray the rosary in my name, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. She also tells them that in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. Then she tells Lucia not to tell this to anyone except Francisco. Lucia, thinking of her mother and the priest and everyone else who doesn't believe her, asks the lady,
Will you please tell us who you are and perform a miracle so that everyone will believe that you appear to us?
The lady replies, Continue to come here every month. In October, I will say who I am and what I desire, and I will perform a miracle all shall see, so that they believe. The crowd then hears a crack of thunder and sees a lantern stand shake as if in an earthquake as the telltale little gray cloud above the tree disappears to the east. And with that, Mary is gone once again. Now, as you might imagine, after a third visit, word is spreading far and wide. But that's a problem. Remember our history lesson at the beginning? That the government of Portugal hates the Catholics and sees them all as just filth to be gotten rid of. While the chief magistrate of the county that Fatima is located in is Artur Oliveira Santos, your typical party line hack. So as more and more people stream into the area in hopes of seeing the apparition, or at least seeing the children, Santos thinks, not on my watch, and summons the children to extract a confession. The children seemingly have nothing to confess, so he releases them. However, on the morning of August 13th, he brings his carriage around to the houses of the children and tells them, Get in, I'll give you a ride. Once the kids are in the carriage, he covers them in a carpet and whisks them away to jail, where they sit for 3 days. Santos even goes so far as to tell the kids that he has a vat of boiling oil for them if they don't confess. The children stand firm. So he leads away Jacinta and puts her someplace else, telling Lucia and Francisco that she's dead. That doesn't work. So he leads away Francisco, telling Lucia he's dead too. Lucia says nothing, even though she completely believes that her 2 cousins are now dead, having been boiled in oil. Santos finally figures out that his bluff didn't work and lets the 3 kids go. The kids are really sad though, because they missed being at the Cova de Areia on the 13th when the lady in white told them to be there. Interestingly enough, even though the children aren't at the Cova de Areia, the crowd of 15,000 people are not disappointed. The crack of thunder comes along with the usual flash, and immediately they notice a little white cloud that hovers over the holm oak. It stays a few minutes, then rises toward the heavens where it disappears. Looking around, they notice everyone's face is glowing rose and red and blue and all the colors of the rainbow. The ground is made of little squares of different colors. Even their clothes are transformed into every color of the rainbow. The trees are covered with flowers. Every leaf is a flower. And evidently, Mother Mary has mercy on the children, since not being there on the 13th isn't their fault. So the next Sunday, August 19th, she appears to them in another place called Valanos. And again, she tells them to keep coming to Cova di Aria on the 13th, keep praying the rosary, and she will prove to the world that the children aren't lying. This is music to Lucia's ears, because this whole time, her entire family still thinks she's lying. Her mother punishes her, and her siblings mock her relentlessly, trying to get her to reveal the secret Our Lady has given her. But little Lucia, though sad, refuses to betray Our Lady's confidence. The children become more and more pious as the weeks of summer pass by, giving up their lunches and even refusing to drink during the hot summer days, all in an effort to increase their own suffering to help the souls of those who need a little help, either earthly or otherworldly. September 13th arrives, and the children have a really hard time getting through the 30,000 people who have lined the entire distance from their homes to Cova di Aria, many of them climbing walls and trees in desperate bids to get their attention, to ask them to intercede on their behalf with Our Lady. When they finally make it to the holm oak tree and it's time for the lady to appear, the familiar signs of her approach begin. The cooling of the air, the dimming of the sun, the crack of thunder. This time, the crowd can see a globe of light coming from the east and settling over the oak tree. Lucia asks the lady, as she does each time, what she can do for the lady in white, and does her best to relay as many messages from the pilgrims as she can. As the lady in white takes her leave, the crowd once again sees the luminous globe ascending into the sky. And this time, they are treated to a shower of iridescent flower petals that vanish when they hit the ground. The next 4 weeks are torture for everyone involved. Believers constantly come calling to the homes of both families, hoping to visit with the children, begging them to deliver their appeals for mercy to the lady. And dealing with the crowds of believers is hard enough, but the unbelievers make things even worse. Neighbors threaten bodily harm to the families if the big miracle doesn't happen on October 13th, as the children say it will. The local magistrates and newspapers are giddy with excitement and can't wait for the big day to arrive. To them, when nothing happens, as they are sure it won't, they get to report it as the big hoax they predicted it to be, and the perfect opportunity to trash the church that they all hate so much. As October 13th gets closer, Lucia's house is coming unglued. Her mother begs her to go to confession and tell the priest that it's all a big lie, afraid of the threats of violence if the lady does not provide a miracle for all to see. Francisco and Jacinta have it better than Lucia. Their dad, T, is a staunch believer and does his best to shield his children. But even with that added protection, priests from neighboring villages stalk the kids, trying to get them to confess the lie. But nothing works. The morning of October 13th, a rain that started the day before continues, making mud of the roads and the fields. But that does not stop the estimated 70,000 people who had been pouring into the area for days. Some estimates go as high as 100,000. The poor little oak tree is now only a trunk, since so many people wanted a leaf or a branch as a souvenir that they stripped the poor little thing bare. But it was now decorated in colorful ribbons and flowers, soaking wet and hanging in the increasing downpour. Getting through the mud and the crowds takes a bit of doing, but Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta finally take their place in front of what's left of the oak tree. A priest approaches the children to ask what time the lady comes.
She comes at noon.
Everyone is silent as noon comes and goes. Minutes pass. The priest starts yelling to anyone who can hear him that it's past noon. Everyone get out of here. The whole thing is an illusion. Lucia stands her ground and sees the lady approaching from the east. The priest goes silent. The miracle has begun. Incidentally, Lucia never saw that priest again. The lady in white tells the children she is Our Lady of the Rosary and that she wants a chapel built in that place in her honor. As she starts to rise in a flood of light, she points to the sun, which seems to immediately brighten as the clouds disappear and the sky clears, and Our Lady of the Rosary stops in the sky to the right of the sun. To the left of the sun appears Saint Joseph holding the baby Jesus, who both make the sign of the cross 3 times over the world. But unlike the others, Lucia can even see the Lord dressed in red as the divine Redeemer, blessing the world. And as the children are enraptured by this heavenly spectacle that only they can see, everyone else is watching the sky for other reasons. The sun, still at its full brightness, becomes possible to look at without hurting your eyes while continuously fading and glowing. Its rays spread everywhere, painting everything they touch in different colors as if they're shining through a stained glass window. Everything, the ground, people's faces, the trees, even the air itself. It stops its light show and starts bouncing around in the sky. Stops, bounces some more before it starts hurtling itself toward the earth on a zigzag course, like it's just falling out of the sky. People start screaming and crying, thinking this is the literal end of the world. But as quickly as it started, the sun returns to its place in the sky. A wave of relief sweeps through the crowd. This whole light show takes about 10 minutes. And when the sun is still again, everyone is a little surprised to discover that their clothes, which had been dripping wet from standing in the rain for hours, are now completely dry, as is the mud on the ground. And these things are seen by both believers and non-believers. In fact, being a believer was not even a guarantee. Some believers saw nothing, while some non-believers saw everything. But those who did see number into the tens of thousands, with many people saying things like, "From those thousands of mouths, I heard shouts of joy and love to the most holy Virgin. And then I believed. I had the certainty of not having been the victim of a suggestion. I had seen the sun as I would never see it again." After what has become known as the miracle of the sun, the children try really hard to get back to their lives, but the multitudes of people showing up at their doors, wanting the children to repeat the words of Our Lady over and over, make that impossible. Francisco and Jacinta spend every available moment in prayer because Our Lady told them she would be coming to take them to heaven soon. Sure enough, the Spanish flu hits Fatima in October of 1918. Everyone in Francisco and Jacinta's family gets sick except for their dad, T, who is left to care for the entire household. Our Lady appears to Francisco and Jacinta again to let them know she will be back for them soon. The children are elated. The flu hits Lucia's house too, and almost everyone in her house gets sick. But Lucia does not. And when she's not tending for her own family, she goes to visit Francisco and Jacinta as often as she can because she knows they will be in heaven soon. Francisco passes away on April 4th, 1919, and Jacinta on February 20th, 1920. Lucia is now on her own. Of course, she's not really on her own. She and her family are still living with the endless stream of visitors wanting to see Lucia. Not long after the miracle of the sun, the Vatican reestablishes the diocese in Leiria, Portugal, of which Fatima is a part. The new bishop, Reverend Joseph Correia de Silva, puts documenting the whole story of everything that happened at Fatima at the top of his priority list. Seeing the undue burden all of the attention is placing on Lucia's family and the town of Fatima itself, he offers to send Lucia away to a convent school where no one would know her real name and no one would bother her. And just like that, Lucia is spirited away in the middle of the night to a new home where she can go to school and worship in peace. When she finishes school, Lucia asks to enter the Order of the Sisters of St. Dorothy, the people who have taken such good care of her. Lucia also receives a few more visits from Our Lady and the child Jesus over the next few years, asking her to spread their message that, in short, people better start praying the rosary. In 1927, Lucia receives permission from Mary to reveal the first two parts of The Secret, the vision of hell and the call for devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary to avoid World War II. But Lucia still carries the third part of The Secret all on her own. In 1929, Mary pays another visit to Lucia and says, "Remember back in 1917 when I said I would be calling for the consecration of Russia? Well, it's time. I am here to call for the consecration of Russia." Her instructions are that all of the bishops in the world, in union with the Pope, must consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. If that is done, the world shall know a lasting peace. In 1931, Lucia gets another visit, basically asking, "Why haven't you consecrated Russia yet?" Interestingly enough, remember Mary's original message from 1917? It basically says, if they do not stop offending God, another and worse war will break out in the reign of Pius XI. And that when you see the night sky illuminated by an unknown light, know that it is a sign from God that the next war is coming. Well, that's kind of specific. Did any of that actually happen? Yes, it did. On January 25th and 26th, 1938, a geomagnetic storm, also called the Fatima storm, lit up the entire night sky with an aurora borealis light storm seen all across the world. And Pope Pius XI reigned from February 6th, 1922 until February 10th, 1939. But the war didn't start until September 1939, right? True, but all the precursors leading up to it and making it inevitable certainly did. And so, as World War II starts raging, Pope Pius XI's successor, Pope Pius XII, says, maybe we should do this consecration thing. So in 1942, he consecrates the whole of humanity, which would naturally include Russia, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Close, but not quite. Then in 1952, he consecrates the people of Russia to the Immaculate Heart, but not in communion with bishops worldwide. Also close, but not quite. In 1964, Pope Paul VI also consecrates humanity, which would include Russia, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In 1981 and 1982, Pope John Paul II also consecrates the whole human race to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But none of those consecrations are done in communion and coordination with the rest of the Catholic bishops of the world. In 1983, Pope John Paul II sets out to get it right this time. And on December 8th, 1983, he sends a letter to all the bishops worldwide, Catholic and Orthodox, asking them to join in on March 25th, 1984, for an act of entrustment to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. He even consults with Sister Lucia to make sure this consecration of Russia would be valid. But when the big day arrives, he's got all the bishops, but does not specifically mention Russia in the actual consecration. But even though we all know by now that that's not the way it's supposed to happen, Sister Lucia comes out and says, "Yup, that's the right one." Now, why would she say that after decades of telling the popes,
"You're doing it wrong"?
The instructions from Mary are pretty self-explanatory. So why cave now? To figure that out, we need to look at what's been up with Sister Lucia over the last 50 years. I hope you guys are hungry because we are about to open a can of worms and scoop out a healthy plateful. Remember in 1927 when Sister Lucia got permission from Mary to reveal the first two parts of The Secret? Well, it takes her a little while to get going, but between 1935 and 1941, she writes 4 memoirs, the last of which contains the messages from the first 2 secrets, the vision of hell, and that we need to pray the rosary and consecrate Russia to avoid World War II. She then gets really sick, and in October of 1943, the Bishop of Fatima tells her she'd better write down the third secret just in case. Of course, as a nun, she is compelled to obey orders from her superiors. Sister Lucy tries to obey, but she just can't bring herself to write it down. In 1944, Our Lady appears to Sister Lucy and says, "Not only is it okay to write it down, but I want it to be revealed to the world no later than 1960. So Sister Lucia writes it down, puts it in a sealed envelope, delivers it personally to her confessor, who in turn delivers it to the Bishop of Fatima, Joseph da Silva, on June 17, 1944. Bishop da Silva puts the envelope into another envelope and hangs on to it, even posing for a picture with it that appears in Life magazine in 1949. In 1957, Pope Pius XII decides maybe the envelope is safer with him at the Vatican. When it's delivered, Bishop John Venancio holds it up to a strong light that can see through both envelopes and sees the letter containing the third secret. He carefully notes that the secret is about 25 lines long. The envelope is then placed in a safe in the papal apartments. So now everyone in the world is just waiting for 1960 to roll around so they can find out what it says. August 17th, 1959, Pope John XXIII reads the 25-line text of the third secret and writes on the envelope, "I leave it to others to comment or decide." Then in 1960, he makes another statement, this time saying, "This matter is not for our times." And on February 8th, the Vatican issues an anonymous press release stating that the third secret would not be disclosed and would probably remain forever under absolute seal. What? It is also noted that in that year, Pope John XXIII reads the 62-line text of the third secret. Wait. How did we pick up an extra 37 lines? The Vatican then brings down the hammer and imposes some really strict conditions of isolation on Sister Lucia. The very same year that the third secret is to be revealed to the world and isn't. Keep in mind that Lucy is already pretty much in isolation as a cloistered nun, but she still has a few things to say. In 1957, in what would become her last public interview that was not pre-approved by the Vatican, Sister Lucy says, "The devil is about to wage a decisive battle with the Blessed Virgin." Take note of that word "about." That seems to indicate that the decisive battle hasn't started yet. And while she never reveals the exact contents of the third secret, Sister Lucia lets loose on a few occasions, talking about the diabolic disorientation infecting the upper hierarchy. Bet that made a few pontiffs angry. But after 1960, up until the time of her death in 2005, Sister Lucy is forbidden to speak about Fatima without direct permission from the Vatican. So some might say that the Vatican is purposefully burying Sister Lucy. But why? What else is going on in the rest of the world? I'll tell you what. Vatican II. The Vatican had just gotten a new pope in October of 1958, John the 23rd, who then, just 3 months later, gives notice of his intention to convene the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, more commonly known as Vatican II. Why? Well, he felt that the church needed updating to better connect with people in an increasingly secularized world. Translation: the church needed to get more hip. But as you might expect, there are a bunch of members of the church, clergy and laymen alike, who all said, "Are you nuts? That's heresy." So the battle lines are drawn. Pope John the 23rd opens Vatican II in October of 1962, but then dies in the summer of 1963. Pope Paul VI is then elected, but he's all in too, so Vatican II just keeps on going. And Sister Lucia has said enough about the contents of the third secret for people to know that it might just be talking about evil infecting the top ranks of the church. So is that why they needed her to be quiet? So they could push through their agenda of fundamental changes to the whole of the Catholic Church? Maybe. But at this point, all of this palace intrigue is pure speculation. Until a curious thing happens. Sister Lucia is not seen in public again until May 13th, 1967, on the 50th anniversary of Fatima, where she appears with Pope Paul VI. It is reported that Sister Lucy asks him to release the third secret, but he refuses. Here is where things get really interesting. Some very observant people took a really close look at the photographs of that meeting and found some really interesting details. The 1967 Sister Lucia does not look like the original Sister Lucia, and these facial differences cannot be attributed to age. Photos were sent to facial analysts, plastic surgeons, oral surgeons, odontologists, and a Guinness Book of World Records holder facial reconstruction artist. She holds the record for the most cases solved from her facial reconstructions. Their conclusions? Not the same person. They don't even look like the same person. The distance between the eyes is different. The distance from the nose to the mouth is different. The chins are really different. But then investigators went a step further and analyzed known handwriting samples from both Lucys. Conclusion? You guessed it, not the same person. But wait, there's more. The photos of Sister Lucia and Pope Paul VI are fakes too. Here's the picture that was published of their meeting together on the Fatima anniversary. Now look at these two originals. They spliced together two pictures to make it look like they were together. That's interesting. There are more details on the differences between the Lucys that I haven't gone deep on. So if you want to go down this rabbit hole on your own, go to sisterlucytruth.org. I will put a link in the description. So what does all of this mean? Well, if you remember our discussion earlier about the list of botched consecrations of Russia, Sister Lucia was pretty vocal in letting the Vatican know when they had not done it correctly until the consecration of 1984, when she comes out and says, "You finally did it right." Even when we know from her own written instructions from Mother Mary that they didn't do it right. Now, what I find really interesting at this point is that supposedly Sister Lucia has already said, "You guys nailed it," but the consecration attempts continue. Well, why? Why would you go through all of that if you have already fulfilled your duty per Mother Mary? Now, just because Sister Lucia is forbidden to talk to the public about the visions at Fatima doesn't mean that we don't hear anything from her. We have letters that she wrote to various people in her life where she had some pretty strong words about the leadership in the church following Vatican II. In 1970, she wrote, "It is painful to see such a great disorientation in so many who occupy places of responsibility. The devil has succeeded in infiltrating evil under cover of good. and the blind are beginning to guide others, as the Lord tells us in his gospel, and souls are letting themselves be deceived. Remember that in 1957, Sister Lucy said the devil was about to wage a decisive battle. By 1971, she says the devil has begun to succeed. But then the question is, which Lucy is writing these letters? The letters are still very critical of the papacy, which has yet to release the third secret, even though they've been commanded to by Mother Mary herself. In 1978, Pope John Paul II takes the wheel, reads the secret, and also decides he's not jumping on that third rail. Discussions about the third secret never stop, and in November of 1984, Cardinal Ratzinger reveals that he has read the third secret. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because Cardinal Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger would go on to become Pope Benedict XVI in 2005. According to him, the secret refers to dangers threatening the faith and life of the Christian, and therefore the life of the world, and the importance of the Novissimi, the last times, the absolute importance of history, and that the things contained in this third secret correspond to what has been announced in Scripture and has been seen again and again in many other Marian apparitions, first of all, that of Fatima. Now, all of that is important because on June 26, 2000, a press conference is called by the Vatican, and Archbishop Bertone publishes the 62-line text, which he claims is the entire third secret. The text describes a vision in which the Pope, or a bishop dressed in white, is killed by a band of soldiers. And it is the Vatican's position that the text is referring to the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. Therefore, the third secret is already in the past. Nothing to see here, folks. But this text sounds nothing like what is described by Cardinal Ratzinger in his 1984 interview. Little side note on Pope John Paul's brush with the assassin. The attempt to kill him came on May 13th, 1981, the anniversary of the first of the Fatima apparitions. Pope John Paul was so convinced that he was saved only by the grace of Our Lady of Fatima that he travels there exactly 1 year later to the day of the assassination attempt and places one of the bullets taken from his body into the crown of the statue of Mary in the sanctuary of Fatima. Back to the third secret. So what the Vatican releases sounds nothing like what different people have said about what they know of the third secret to this point. Sister Lucia herself has told us that part of the text contains the phrase, "In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved," which kind of leads you to believe that there is a but in there somewhere. But none of the 65 lines of text that the Vatican releases makes sense as going with that initial statement. And how exactly did we get from 25 to 62 lines? Since it's a matter of record that in 1957, the letter directly from Sister Lucia was 25 lines. I can't find an answer to that anywhere. But that is certainly part of why there is a growing number of people who believe that the text published in 2000 is not the whole secret. And that it's not about a vision of bishops in white being killed by soldiers. In 1995, Cardinal Mario Luigi Sciappi, the personal theologian of 5 popes, says, "In the third secret, it is foretold, among other things, that the great apostasy in the church will begin at the top. The next few years contain a whole lot of catfighting between officials at the Vatican and people who say the Vatican is withholding the whole truth. In the midst of this papal chaos, Sister Lucia dies at the convent of Santa Teresa in Coimbra, Portugal, in 2005 at the age of 98. But the controversy does not die with her. In May of 2010, Pope Benedict XVI, who takes over for John Paul II when he passes away in 2005, on his pilgrimage to Portugal, shocks the press and the world, especially the Catholics, by saying that the third secret of Fatima tells us that not only from the outside come the attacks against the Pope and the Church, but the sufferings of the Church come from right inside the Church, from the sin that resides inside the Church. And then just 2 days later, in front of 500,000 pilgrims, he announces, "Whoever thinks the prophetic mission of Fatima is concluded deceives himself." So now what? Well, it appears as though the papacy is not done trying to make things right. On March 15th, 2022, Pope Francis sends out a letter to all the bishops letting them know that another consecration of Russia is taking place on March 25th, the same day that John Paul performed his consecration in 1984. The consecration happens exactly as scheduled, with Pope Francis reciting the prayer, "Mother of God and our Mother, to your immaculate heart we solemnly entrust and consecrate ourselves, the Church, and all humanity, especially Russia and Ukraine." Think it'll work this time? I guess only time will tell. And for those of you who think the Vatican is the bad guy and has some splaining to do, take heart that there are those within the Vatican walls working for the same thing. A high-ranking Archbishop, Pietro Sambi, attaché to the Vatican Secretary of State, tells one of his friends that he needs to read this book called The Secret Still Hidden, which alleges a cover-up by the Vatican of a second companion text to the one released in 2000. When his friend expresses his surprise at Archbishop Sambi recommending a book critical of his own office, Sambi says, "In the end, we are all after the truth, aren't we? The truth is the important thing." And the one you've been waiting for, the top episode of the InBetween for 2024. This episode not only broke our channel's charts, but caused an explosion of comments from thousands of people, making it far and away the #1 episode of the year, with the #1 question being, why is it always a triangle? Vermont. Not a state you hear about very often. If you're like me, the only thing you know about Vermont is that it's the location of the Stratford Inn in the TV show Newhart.
I'm Larry. This is my brother Daryl. That's my other brother Daryl.
Little did I know that Vermont is the home of something called the Bennington Triangle, so named by paranormal author and New Englander himself, Joseph A. Citro, to describe the rough outline of weirdness that is pretty much centered around Glastonbury Mountain in the Green Mountains of Vermont. For the paranormally uninitiated, it's a beautiful setting, perfect for fishing and hunting and hiking, with the Appalachian Trail and a trail called the Long Trail, which is a hiking trail running the entire length of Vermont, north to south, joining up together, running straight through the Green Mountains for the entire southern half of Vermont until the Appalachian Trail curves east into New Hampshire. Mr. Citro was mostly referring to a string of missing 411-style disappearances that happened in the area. Link in the description to our video on David Paulides' missing 411 phenomena. But anyone who lives in the area can tell you there's way more going on there than just disappearing people. And this is one of those places that kind of remind me of Dudleytown. Also a link in the description, in that it seems to have been trouble from the very start. So the area we are talking about is roughly between the cities of Bennington, Wilmington, and Manchester. Basically the area surrounding the lower portion of the Green Mountains, though some people would say it stretches even further north than that to encompass pretty much the whole of the Green Mountain Range. The first clue that there might be an issue with the area is that the Algonquin Native Americans wouldn't go up those mountains. The only time they set foot up there was to bury their dead. And they've been in the area for 10,000 years, so they might have a clue. To them, it was the place where the four winds came together, making it a cursed and dangerous place. Why don't we ever pay attention to Native American curses? And apparently, if you're standing on the top of Glastonbury Mountain, the winds can really be unpredictable and can hit you from different directions and become disorienting. But it's not just the winds that the Indians were avoiding. It was the man-eating rock. Legend tells of a large boulder somewhere on the top of the mountain that looks like any other rock. But should you make the mistake of standing or sitting on it, it'll just swallow you up. Poof! You're gone. But since we never seemed to listen to the natives, early settlers to the area came, saw the endless supply of wood for the booming timber industry, and named their new town Glastonbury. Now, between the logging industry and the charcoal industry, Glastonbury was a booming little place. If you can call a peak population of 241 people booming. From the very beginning, there were reports of strange lights and thunderbirds in the skies, wild men and ghosts in the woods, and strange noises and obnoxious odors in the air. That's a new one. Business kept on chugging away, but they had a problem getting the wood down from the mountain. Solution? The steepest railroad line ever built, with a rise of 250 feet per mile for 9 miles. Problem solved. Until that endless supply of lumber ended. That's right, they shaved that mountain of its forest like the Onceler harvested the truffle trees. Great. No trees, no industry. But they still had the railroad. So they decided to throw every penny they had into changing the area into a tourist destination. Worked great for the first year. But the dirt bare mountaintop was now prone to flooding. In the second year, a huge flood wiped out the tracks. Just like that, no more tourist town. The population dwindled until it was down to just 3, the Madison family. Made for easy elections. Between the 3 of them, they held every office in town. But the state of Vermont eventually got wind of the situation and disorganized the city in 1937. But don't think for a second that all that time passed without incident. In 1897, opening day of Vermont's very first hunting season, John Harbour goes out with his brother and a family friend to their deer camp in Bickford Hollow. The 3 men are out hunting when a shot rings out and John is heard yelling, "I've been shot!" His brother and friend start searching immediately, but don't find him until 11 a.m. the next day. He's lying dead under a cedar tree with his loaded gun propped up against the tree next to him. Except he wasn't shot there. Someone or something moved him from where he was shot to where he lay under the tree. The tracks are pretty easy to follow, but they're drag marks. He didn't crawl there. He didn't walk there. And if he was shot some distance away, how did his gun end up right next to him? Mr. Harbour's murder is unsolved to this day. And with that little morsel of strangeness, strap on your oxygen tanks because we are diving into the deep end. If you Google Bennington Triangle, chances are that 9 out of 10 results will be talking about a series of 5 disappearances that happened between 1945 and 1950. But here's the kicker. If we go back just 3 more years, starting in 1942, then that number jumps to 10 disappearances in 8 years. The first disappearance isn't generally included in what I'm going to call the famous 5, but I thought it merited some attention, if only for the fact that the person who disappeared was only 13 years old. There isn't really any information about what happened, but on October 11th, 1942, 13-year-old Melvin Hills disappears from the Bennington area. His body is never found. Skip to 1945 and we come to the first of the famous 5, Mitty Rivers. Mitty is a 74-year-old hunting guide who had lived in the area his whole life. In November of 1945, he's guiding a group of 4 friends along the east side of Glastonbury Mountain. As they're on their way back to camp after a long day of hunting, Mitty pulls ahead of the group and says, "I'll meet you up ahead." But they don't find him up ahead. He just vanishes. The only thing they ever find is a bullet lying on the ground next to a creek. So the theory is floated that he must have bent over for a drink from the creek and fell in. Okay, but where's his gun? And where is he? Neither his body nor any of his belongings are ever found. Just 1 year later, on December 1st, 1946, Paula Weldon, an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, finishes up her shift in the school cafeteria, goes back to her room, changes her clothes, and tells her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, "I'm going to go for a hike on the Long Trail." She heads out the door around 2:45 that afternoon, wearing a red coat, jeans, and lightweight tennis shoes. Shortly after that, a guy named Louis Knapp picks up a hitchhiker just outside the entrance to the college. It's a blonde, college-age girl wearing a red coat. Louis takes the girl from the college and drops her off on Route 9, almost at the entrance to the Long Trail. The girl thanks him for the ride and starts walking in the direction of the trail. As Paula keeps walking, she passes a few houses where several residents see her walking by. One of them was Ernie Whitman, who warned her that she probably doesn't want to hit the trail now, since it's already late in the afternoon and she's not dressed all that warm. Paula politely thanks him for the advice and keeps walking, never to be seen again. Her roommate reports her missing the next day, and a massive search is launched. Unfortunately for investigators, it snowed a few inches during the night. Paula's dad comes rushing into town to help with the search, and classes at Bennington are called off so students can help too. It seems pretty obvious from the start that nobody knows what they're doing. Unfortunately for Paula, that suboptimal start to her case would only continue as the fruitless searches are called off and a more formal investigation begins. Problem is, at this point, Vermont has no state police, so communication and coordination between neighboring cities and counties is less than thorough. Vermont did have a state investigator, Almo Franzoni, who is assigned and takes over the case just a few days in, along with investigators provided by New York and Connecticut. However, they're a little handicapped from the start because no one kept any records of anything they were doing for the first 10 days. Long story short, no trace of Paula is ever found. However, her family and friends do have the meager comfort of knowing that her disappearance is the catalyst for the state of Vermont to form a state police department with the chartered purpose of overseeing all missing person cases for the entire state. Because she was lost, countless other people have been found. Okay, so from that case that to this day is still in the back of the heads of Vermonters, we jump ahead 3 years to 1949. This case is not one of the famous 5, so there's no real information about it, but that winter, 3 hunters all go missing in the Glastonbury area. I'm not sure if they were all together or if it was 3 separate cases, but 3 hunters in one winter is pretty significant. Jump ahead 1 more year and we come to the case of Paul Jepson. On October 12th of 1950, Paul is an 8-year-old boy who's riding in the family truck with his mom. His mom drives to the dump where they house their pigs to move them to a different spot in the dump. It's a 30-minute chore she does every day around 3:30. So she leaves Paul in the truck while she goes and takes care of the pigs. But when she returns, Paul is not in the truck. The mom frantically searches for him for a few minutes, but quickly calls the police, who start an immediate search with bloodhounds and the whole works. The police figured he'd be pretty easy to find. He's wearing a bright red jacket, so he should stick out like a sore thumb. But they're wrong. Interesting side note. Remember, Paula had on a red jacket too. To this day, there is a superstition by those in the know that if you're going on to the mountain, don't wear red. The bloodhounds looking for Paul do manage to follow a scent trail down a nearby road for a while, but lose it when they hit a crossroads. Paul's father would later tell reporters that Paul had recently seemed obsessed with the mountains, as if they were somehow calling to him. Hundreds of volunteers searched the area, but Paul was never found. A mere 16 days later, so October 28, 1950, Frida Langer, her husband Max, and her cousin Herbert Elsner are camping in their cabin near Somerset Reservoir. Frida and her husband have owned this place for 14 years, so I think it's safe to say she's familiar with her environment. That day, the three had planned to go on an afternoon hunt, but Max is plagued by a sore knee and tells Frida and Herbert, just go on without me. So they do. And they're not out for very long when Frida slips on a rock and falls into a creek. Now she's going to get cold. So she and Herbert start walking together back towards the cabin so Frida can change her clothes. It's about 3:50 in the afternoon already, and they get to within about 500 feet of the cabin when Frida goes on ahead to change and Herbert stays put just to wait for her. Herbert's waiting and waiting, wondering what in the world could be taking Frida so long. After almost an hour, he gives up and goes back to the cabin, asking Max, what's up with Frida? Max tells him, I haven't seen her. The two men do a quick search for her, but Frida is nowhere. Well, how can that be? She's hunted in this area for 14 years. She was only 500 feet from the cabin. There's no way she got lost. They don't find her that night, so the next day, Max continues to search while Herbert calls the authorities. In the next 2 weeks, 5 separate searches, including dogs and helicopters, are conducted for Frida, with not a trace of her ever found. Until May 12th, 1951, 7 months later. That day, 2 men are fishing about 3 miles from the Langer cabin when they see something odd in the tall reeds. That something odd turns out to be Frida. Her remains are pretty badly decomposed, but the coroner's report states that she died of accidental drowning. Are you kidding me? Frida knew that place like the back of her hand. She's gonna wander 3 miles away, fall into a swamp, and drown? Okay. But the biggest kicker is that swamp area had been searched multiple times when she first went missing. And Frida wasn't there. So what happened to Frida that snatched her away when she was almost home and then dumped her body 3 miles away after the searches were over? That's the million-dollar question. Okay, so we're going back a bit for the last story of the famous 5 because I thought this one was so good I had to save it for last. The story of James Tetford. James Tetford is a veteran of World War I. When he comes home from the war, it takes him a while to get back into the groove of life, but he eventually marries his wife Pearl and they settle down in the Fletchertown area of Franklin, Vermont. And life is good and quiet. Then World War II erupts and James feels the call to serve his country once more. So he goes off for a second tour of duty, leaving Pearl to wait and pray that he makes it home safely. Thankfully, he does. He returns to Fletchertown and settles back into his routine with Pearl at his side. But this normal life would not stay normal for long. Shortly after his return, James comes home one day to find his house empty. Looking around, he sees that it looks like Pearl's in the middle of making dinner. So he thinks, well, she must have just needed something and just ran out to go get it. So he waits for her. By the time late evening rolls around, James is worried and starts talking to the neighbors and anyone else he can find. He finds out that Pearl had been to the neighborhood Amoco station earlier in the day, but she seemed perfectly normal and happy. But that's all he finds out. When she's not home by the next day, James calls the police. Of course, the first theory is that she left on her own. Pearl is much younger than James, so maybe she just didn't want to be his wife anymore. But no one who knew her said that they noticed any kind of issues. And why leave without leaving a note of any kind, with a partially made dinner in the kitchen? But Pearl was never seen again. Her disappearance wrecks James. He falls into a deep depression, stops seeing all of his family and friends, and sits home alone, staring at the walls. Eventually, in 1947, he moves into the Soldiers' Retirement Home in Bennington, where he maintains his solitary existence and not really making any friends. The only time his monotonous existence ever changes is when occasionally he would take the bus to northern Vermont to visit relatives in St. Albans, which is about an 8-hour bus ride through the Green Mountains. So November of 1949, James boards the bus for one of these visits, maybe a little Turkey Day action, spends a few days with the fam, and boards the bus to go back home on December 1st, which, coincidentally, is 3 years to the day from when Paula Weldon went missing. Anyway, he gets on the bus for the routine ride back to Bennington, but he never makes it home. The retirement home knew when he was expected back, so when he doesn't show, they report him missing, and an investigation is launched. The investigation, of course, zeroes in on the bus ride. The bus driver and the 14 other passengers are contacted for information, but the information they provide is not exactly what the investigators expect to hear. According to those on the bus, they all remember seeing James there. They even remember seeing him in his seat when the bus left the station from the last stop before Bennington. And several people remember seeing him sleeping in his seat along the way between those two stops. But when the bus pulls into the Bennington station, James's seat is now empty. His luggage is in the overhead rack, and personal effects, including his wallet with cash inside, are still stowed in his seat area. No one saw him get up from his seat, and the bus did not stop from when they left the last station to when they pulled into the Bennington station. Now, there's no way this guy's getting off of a moving bus without someone noticing. But no trace of James is ever found. Now, if you've been keeping count, that's only 9 of the 10 disappearances. The very last, which again is not part of the famous 5, is the story of Carol Herrick that occurred in 1943. Carol is a 37-year-old hunter who goes out hunting with his cousin Henry Herrick on November 23, 1943, in the forest around West Townsend, roughly 10 miles to the northeast of Bennington. The two get split up. No big deal until Carol doesn't make it back to camp that night. Henry calls the police and a search is started immediately. The searchers find nothing until 3 days later, Henry finds Carol's body, obviously deceased. Carol's face is all black with a few scrapes and scratches on his arms and hands. And the ground all around him is covered in huge tracks that are thought to be bear tracks. His gun is propped against a tree 70 feet from his body with one expended shell on the ground. The coroner's report proves to be a bit surprising. Carol's cause of death is from his lung being punctured by one of his own ribs. He was squeezed to death. The prevailing theory is that Carol was attacked by a bear, that a huge bear came his way, he shot at it, and then put his gun down to go check to see if it was dead. But it wasn't, so it got up and attacked him, somehow wrapping its arms around him and squeezing him to death. Seriously? The Green Mountains do have a decent black bear population, but when's the last time you heard of a bear standing up and hugging someone to death? The term bear hug does not mean that bears can literally hug. And what kind of seasoned hunter is going to think that they brought down a huge bear with just one shot? Does it really make sense that he would not have kept his rifle at the ready, knowing he was probably going to have to shoot it again? And how did he get 70 feet away from his gun? Did Carol try to run only to be caught and brought down by the bear? Or was he dragged and placed in that spot? Last but not least, how could he have endured an attack so brutal that he was literally squeezed to death, yet have no real cuts or bite marks? Last time I checked, a bear's main method of attack is its claws and its jaws. Yet Carol only has a few scuff marks. So I just gotta ask, was this really a bear? Or was it something else? Perhaps something of a taller, hairier variety. Big feet sightings are not super common on the mountain, but they are far from rare, with the first one on record being all the way back in the early 19th century. A stagecoach full of people is making its way through the mountains around present-day Woodford. It's late, it's dark, and it's raining buckets, causing havoc on the dirt road. Between the rain and the iffy road, the stagecoach driver has to slow down to a crawl and eventually stop the coach completely. The driver jumps down with his lantern to try to get a better look at the condition of the road in front of them when he sees footprints in the mud. And considering how hard the rain is coming down, the fact that he can still see them means they must be pretty fresh. The tracks are widely spaced, telling the driver that whatever made them is huge. The driver yells back to the passengers to see if anyone knows anything about animal tracks. He wants a second opinion. As the passengers start to get out to get a look at these enormous tracks the driver's talking about, the horses start to get spooked. Something is lurking close by that the horses don't like. As the driver is trying to calm the horses, something huge smashes into the side of the stagecoach. Whoever's left in the coach quickly scrambles out into the pouring rain, terrified as whatever it is lurking in the dark continues to bash the side of the stagecoach until it finally topples over onto its side. The passengers huddle up in the driving rain, scared out of their minds, searching the dark to try to figure out what on earth could push over their heavy stagecoach. And they see it, or at least part of it. They can see its eyes, and based on where those eyes are, they estimate the height of the creature to be roughly 8 feet tall. And this is the birth of what today is known as the Bennington Monster. Just a little side note. While almost all of the descriptions I read about the Bennington Monster describe a Bigfoot-like creature, I did find one place that described the Bennington Monster as something that has the body of a large cat and a lizard head with wings, stands between 5 and 7 feet tall, and has a bone-chilling, mountain-reverberating scream. Huh, that's just slightly different. So, which is the true Bennington Monster? I have no idea. Maybe they'll have to cage match it someday to determine the winner of the title. Now, of course, there are plenty of explanations for lots of these events. Hunters will be the first to tell you that getting hit by the four winds on the top of Glastonbury Mountain is a very disorienting experience that can quickly set you on the wrong path and get you lost. But getting lost does not equate to vanishing without a trace. And there were certainly plenty of people theorizing that the fate of the famous 5, actually 10, must have been the responsibility of a serial killer. But serial killers usually have certain profiles of victims. These 10 people who vanished in those 8 years are male and female, young and old, and at least one of them was riding on a bus, which of course naturally leads us to explanations of a more unearthly kind. Look at James Tedford, the bus rider. Even the popular portal theory doesn't work for him since he was on a moving bus. About the only thing that does make sense is being snatched by a UFO. And while, according to the Manchester Journal, Vermont is the second highest state for UFO sightings per capita, when you look at the incident tracking data at the National UFO Reporting Center, or NUFORC, there isn't any more sightings in the Bennington Triangle area than there are in the rest of the state. And while the city of Bennington certainly has its share of NUFORC reports, they mainly consist of sightings of odd lights in the sky. Not super strange and mysterious enough for a channel that reports on the strange and mysterious. However, I did find this report that I find rather intriguing from northern Vermont. I know, not our target area for today, but it's still a great encounter. Sometime in the 1970s, a man who coincidentally grew up in the Green Mountains, but now lives in Burlington, works as a police officer in Montpelier. Every morning, he would make the 30-mile drive from Burlington to Montpelier and then drive back to Burlington again at night. This one particular night, he's driving along and sees what looks to be a construction project going on off the side of the road on a small mountain. Now, driving this road every day, he thought he knew pretty much every construction project that existed on this route, but he doesn't remember this one. As he's driving, he comes up on a spot where half a dozen other people have stopped to see what's going on. So he stops as well. He can see a huge, dark shape, the mountain covered in bright lights. He can't hear anything over the sound of the highway, so if there's any sound, it's really low. The air is slightly foggy, so the bright lights make it hard to make anything else out. But this is October, so he figures that there must be a new ski resort trying to hurry and get construction done in time for this year's ski season. Okay, whatever. He gets in his car and he heads home. The next day, curious to see in the daylight just what this massive construction project actually is, he stops on his way to work at the same mile marker he had stopped at the night before. There is no mountain. He looks around and knows for a fact that he's standing in the same place he was standing just the night before, but there's nothing there. To this day, he insists what he saw was a giant UFO that landed in rural Vermont. Okay, so far we have Bigfoot in the 1800s, missing 411s in the 1940s, and UFOs in the 1970s. So, is there still weirdness going on today? There is. One account comes from Chad Abramovich, creator of the Obscure Vermont website, who wrote a post entitled The Vanished Town of Glastonbury and the Bennington Triangle. In that post, Chad, the self-described cartography buff and skeptic, took a trip a few years ago with some friends on a beautiful sunny July day to the once town of Glastonbury to see the ruins of the ghost town for himself. Based on Chad's age, I'm thinking this was probably around the early 2000s. They travel in a pickup truck up the bumpy forest road and find what's left of the town, mainly old cellar foundations hidden under years of tall grass and trees. As they're enjoying their post-urban exploration, that beautiful July day quickly turns into a fierce thunderstorm with torrential rain. They decide to wait it out for a while until it dawns on them that if the rain washes out the road, they're stuck there. So they carefully make their way back down the mountain through the pouring rain until they make it back to the flats, only to discover that once they're off the mountain, everything is bone dry. They asked some people in the area if they had rain or if they saw the storm roll by. No one in the town had seen a thing. Now, of course, this story is pretty anecdotal, but couple that with this next story, now we're getting somewhere. In 2008, Robert Singley, who's a music composition teacher at Bennington College, decides to take a day hike up Bald Mountain to get some inspiration for his new string quartet composition he's working on. He parks his car, hikes a ways up the mountain, works for a while, eats some lunch, checks out some of the scenery, and decides it's probably time to head home. And with all of this put together, he's about 3 miles from his car. He starts walking east, back down the same trail toward his car. And after about 4 or 5 miles, dawns on him that he should have gotten there by now. As his panic starts to wake up at the thought that he might be lost, Robert says, everything like crescendoed into this weird sort of dizzying confusion. It just suddenly got dark, and then it was like, where am I? What's going on? I was totally lost. Making matters worse, a fog rolls in, making the growing dark even darker. But he's an experienced hiker, so he quells the panic as much as he can and takes stock of his situation. His shorts are not ideal for the overnight temperatures, but he's wearing a long sleeve shirt with a wool sweater, a raincoat, and a winter hat and mittens. But since this was just supposed to be a day hike that he had done many times before, he did not have his compass or a GPS or even a watch. And when he fishes into his backpack for his headlamp, it's broken. Robert is stuck. Knowing he's going to have to make a stand right where he is until morning, he finds a maple tree that, according to him, is expelling some kind of weird energy. Drawn to that energy, he hunkers down and tries to get some rest. But the wet and the cold kind of shoots that idea. So he decides to make a fire to keep warm. And as he's trying to find firewood in the dark, he keeps finding these large animal bones instead. Creepy. He finally finds some wood, and with his matches and some paper from his composition book, I hope they were the blank pages, he's able to get a fire going and keep warm through the unusually quiet night. Once it's light enough, Robert starts walking in the direction he thinks his car is. But after 3 or 4 miles, he hits a sign letting him know that he's no longer on Bald Mountain. He's now almost at the top of Glastonbury Mountain. He turns around, retracing his steps to the maple tree where he should be able to retrace his steps from the night before to pick up the trail that he should have taken. But the trail back to familiar territory looks strangely unfamiliar, with debris on the trail that he certainly would remember crossing. By 11:30 that morning, Robert is found by Vermont State Police. Thanks to Paula. His final thoughts on the whole affair? Robert says, "Either I took a side trail, which doesn't make sense, or something weird happened." So if you made it this far into the episode, I have saved the best legend for last. The legend of the Pigman of Northfield. Northfield is a little north of our Bennington Triangle area, but still within the greater weirdness of the Green Mountains. The story goes that on Halloween of 1951, a 17-year-old boy named Sam Harris ventures into the woods armed with a basket of eggs, planning on a night of Halloween mayhem. But Sam never comes out of those woods. Search parties are formed, the woods are searched, but no sign of Sam is ever found. As time rolls on, a dark rumor starts circulating that Sam has been possessed by the devil himself, who turned him into a grotesque, pig-like creature. The smoke of the rumor slowly turns into fire as occasional sightings of the creature begin to spread through town. It's described as humanoid, with a body covered in long white hair, a face that looks eerily like a pig, and hands with long claws. And it makes grunting and squealing sounds that send shivers down the spines of even the most stoic of eyewitnesses. Most of the sightings occur close to a place called the Devil's Washbowl, known for its caves, waterfalls, and dark, ominous, tangled woods. And as warnings of the creature continue to spread, more and more people start exploring the Devil's Washbowl, looking for any evidence of its existence. What they find only makes things worse. They find piles of animal bones in the caves, including pig bones. And just so you know, Vermont is not known for its wild boar. So the pigs must have come from area farms. Is Pigman stealing livestock? Once the news gets out that something is actually living in the caves of the Devil's Washbowl and stealing livestock, people start avoiding the area as much as possible, especially around Halloween. But to this day, there are plenty of people out there who will swear to seeing this monster with their own eyes. In the 1970s, Ethan is camping in the Devil's Washbowl with some friends. They wake up in the middle of the night to hear strange noises coming from deeper in the woods. They all thought it must be just regular woods at night sounds. But the noises get closer and louder. The campers start to feel very uneasy. They still have a fire going, which is throwing a little light into the woods. Everyone is now awake and watching. They see something moving just at the edge of the firelight, and they will never forget what they see. It is a half man, half animal, covered in white fur, with a half human, half pig face. The creature lets out an ear-piercing squeal and charges at the campers, who run terrified into the night. In 1971, a Northfield farmer hears some strange noises in his backyard one night. He turns on his outside light and looks through the kitchen window, expecting to see a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal running away from the light. But that's not what he sees. Instead, lurking at the edge of the glow cast by the yard light, the farmer sees a figure the size of a full-grown man with a body covered in white hair with the face of a pig. He only sees it for a few seconds before the creature runs away. But just a few days later, there's a dance at the local high school. Some kids are hanging out in the parking lot when they see the same pig-faced, white-haired creature seen by the farmer. And apparently, both parties to the interaction must have been startled because everyone turned and ran away. How creepy is that? Now, one final note to all of our Dogman lovers out there. Much to my chagrin, Vermont appears to be a Dogman-free state, at least right now. There are no Dogman encounters anywhere close to Vermont posted on either North American Dogman Project or dogmanencounters.com. Nor could I find any stories anywhere else. I just want you to know I tried. So there you have it, the top 5 episodes for 2024. We here at the InBetween would like to extend our sincerest thank yous to all of you for making this year such a great one for the channel. And we can't wait to get started on making even more strange and mysterious content for you in 2025. So from our little InBetween family, I would like to wish you all happy holidays and a happy new year. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the InBetween.